She has not worked a single day since college. Your Honor. The words echoed off the mahogany walls of the federal courtroom, heavy with practiced theatricality. My father, Richard, stood at the plaintiff table adjusting his custom-tailored suit. At 62, he still possessed the commanding, arrogant presence of a senior corporate litigator who was used to crushing people for a living. Today, the person he was trying to crush was me. My daughter, Gwen, is 33 years old. Richard continued, his voice dripping with paternal sorrow, turning to face the jury box. She has no verifiable income. She lives in a rundown studio apartment, and yet she somehow convinced my late wife, her own mother, a woman dying of stage 4 pancreatic cancer and clouded by heavy doses of medication, to sign over a trust fund containing $500,000. She is a parasite, Your Honor, a thief who preyed on a dying woman. I sat at the defense table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not react to the collective gasp of the jury or the venomous glare from my younger sister Audrey, who was dabbing at dry eyes with a designer tissue in the front row. Beside me, my attorney David shifted in his chair. A former military lawyer with a touch of gray at his temples, David was the only person in this room who was not buying my father and his performance. He stood up without offering a dramatic rebuttal. He simply picked up a heavy manila envelope from our table, walked past my father, and approached the bench. The envelope was secured with a thick red wax seal bearing the unmistakable crest of the United States Department of Defense. Your Honor, David said, his voice calm and terrifyingly even. Before the plaintiff continues this narrative, the defense submits Exhibit A for your immediate classified review. The judge, a stern man who had been nodding along with my father and his emotional speech just moments before, frowned. He took the envelope, broke the red wax seal, and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper. I watched the judge scan the first paragraph. I watched the blood completely drain from his face. The judge slowly took off his reading glasses. His hands were shaking. He looked past my father, past the jury, and stared directly at me with a mixture of profound shock and sudden deep respect. He grabbed his gavel and slammed it down. All rise. Court is in recess. I want this courtroom cleared immediately. Jury, you are dismissed for the day. Bailiff, lock the doors. My name is Gwen, and I am 33 years old. Before I tell you how a single piece of paper from the Pentagon utterly destroyed my father and his legal career, bankrupted my sister, and sent my brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary, we need to rewind. We need to go back 8 months to the day it all started, the day we buried my mother. If you have ever been underestimated by the very people who were supposed to support you, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe because you will absolutely want to hear how I handled what came next. The sky over the Boston Cemetery was a bruised, heavy gray, weeping a steady drizzle that turned the manicured grass into a slick sponge. I stood a few yards away from the open grave holding a cheap black umbrella. I had not shed a tear yet. Not because I did not miss my mother, since she was the only person in the world who truly understood me, but because I knew she would not want me crying in front of the vultures currently surrounding her casket. Can you angle the umbrella a bit more to the left because the lighting is terrible? I turned my head. Audrey, dressed in a black designer dress that was entirely too tight for a funeral, was posing next to a marble headstone. Her husband Malik was acting as her personal photographer, snapping photos on his phone. An African-American man in his mid-30s, Malik ran a boutique investment fund and carried himself with the slick, predatory confidence of a Wall Street shark. Audrey was a social media influencer, the proud founder of a cosmetics line that she constantly flaunted online. To her, our mother and her funeral was just another content opportunity, a chance to show her followers her vulnerable side. Perfect Babe Malik instructed, adjusting the collar of his bespoke overcoat. Now look down like you are lost in thought. Are you two seriously doing a photo shoot right now? I asked, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the rain. Audrey rolled her eyes, not bothering to drop her mournful pose. Oh, please, Gwen, save the self-righteous act. Some of us actually have a brand to maintain. My followers expect updates. Not all of us have the luxury of sitting around in sweatpants playing video games all day like you. Your mother is not even in the ground yet, I replied, ignoring the jab about my lifestyle. Before Audrey could snap back, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I did not need to turn around to know it was my father. I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the scent of stale scotch. Do not speak to your sister that way, Richard growled, stepping into my line of sight. He did not offer a hug. He did not ask how I was holding up. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, pulled out a thick folded legal document, and shoved it hard against my chest. Instinctively, I brought my hand up to catch it before it fell into the mud. What is this? I asked, looking down at the blue legal backing. It is a subpoena, Richard said, his voice dropping to a vicious, quiet hiss so the remaining funeral guests would not hear. And a notice of frozen assets. I filed the injunction at 8 this morning. I stared at the paperwork. You are suing me at Mom and her funeral. I am reclaiming what you stole, Richard said, stepping closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. I reviewed your mother and her private accounts yesterday. $500,000. Transferred directly to a shell corporation registered under your name just 3 days before she died. Did you really think I would not notice, Gwen? Did you think you could manipulate a woman dying of cancer into funding your pathetic unemployed existence? Mom was completely lucid, Richard, I said, dropping the title of Dad entirely. She transferred that money to me voluntarily. It was an investment. An investment. Audrey scoffed, walking over and linking her arm through Malik and his arm. In what exactly your streaming subscriptions? You live in a 400-square-foot dump in South Boston. You have not held a real job since you dropped out of that coding boot camp. You do not know the first thing about business. Audrey is right, Malik chimed in, his smooth baritone voice laced with condescension. Look, Gwen, Audrey and I are expanding our operations. Her cosmetics brand is about to open 3 new retail locations, and my fund is backing the expansion. That $500,000 was supposed to be our bridge capital. Your mom promised it to us. You swooping in and taking advantage of her dementia is not just sick, it is criminal. I looked at Malik. I noticed the slight tremor in his hand. I noticed the subtle sweat on his brow despite the chill in the air. He was trying to project power, but I recognized desperation when I saw it. He did not just want that money, he needed it. Desperately. Mom did not have dementia, I said calmly, slipping the subpoena into my coat pocket. And she did not promise you a dime, Audrey. She knew exactly how you spend money. She knew your brand is bleeding cash. That money is gone. I have already put it to work. Richard and his face contorted with rage. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my coat. Listen to me, you little parasite. You have 48 hours to reverse that wire transfer. If that money is not back in the family trust by Tuesday, I will drag you through the mud. I will freeze every penny you have. I will ruin whatever pathetic life you have managed to scrape together, and I will see you behind bars for elder abuse. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. Then I looked him dead in the eye. I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink away. Take your hand off me, I said, my tone completely devoid of emotion. Richard hesitated, surprised by the absolute ice in my voice, and slowly let go. I will see you in court, Richard, I said. I turned on my heel and walked away, my cheap sneakers squelching in the mud, leaving my family standing over my mother and her grave, utterly convinced they had already won. The rain was coming down in heavy sheets by the time I reached the cemetery gates. I did not hail a black car or a private town car. Like the rest of the funeral guests, I opened an app on my phone and ordered the cheapest shared ride option available. I stood under the dripping awning of the graveyard administrative building with the subpoena heavy in my pocket, playing the part of the destitute, helpless daughter to perfection. A sleek black luxury sport utility vehicle pulled up to the curb a few feet away. The tinted passenger window rolled down with a quiet hum, revealing Malik. He leaned across the leather console, a smug, predatory smile playing on his lips, waiting for the bus. Gwen. He mocked the engine of the luxury vehicle, purring softly. Look, I am a reasonable guy. I deal with distressed assets for a living. You are in over your head. Richard is going to tear you apart in deposition. He is going to subpoena your bank records, your emails, your search history. You cannot afford a lawyer to fight him. I kept my gaze fixed on the street, watching the taillights of passing cars smear in the rain. I will manage, Malik chuckled, a low, condescending sound. I can make this easy for you. Wire the 500,000 to my fund holding account by tomorrow morning. If you do, I will talk Richard down. I will tell him it was a misunderstanding that Mom just got confused with the routing numbers. I will even write you a check for $10,000 out of my own pocket just to help you get back on your feet. 10 grand is more money than you have seen in 5 years, Gwen. Take the deal. Because if you do not, I promise you, Richard will make sure you go to federal prison. I finally turned to look at him. His eyes were wide and intense. The fake concern masked a frantic urgency. He was not negotiating from a position of strength. He was begging from a position of terror. Your fund must be doing terribly if you are out here extorting your dead mother-in-law and her scapegoat for $500,000, I said flatly, Malik, and his smile vanished. The mask slipped, revealing a flash of pure, unfiltered panic before anger quickly replaced it. You are making a massive mistake, you arrogant little nobody. When Richard is done with you, you will be begging me for $1. The window rolled up sharply and the vehicle sped off into the rain, its tires spraying dirty water onto the curb. Minutes later, a beat-up economy car pulled up. I climbed into the back seat, shaking the water from my umbrella. The driver asked how my day was going. I gave a polite, non-committal answer, leaned my head against the cold window, and finally allowed myself to think. My family thought they knew me. They thought I was a college dropout who spent her days wasting away in a tiny apartment, a failure who could not hack it in the real world. That was the story I had let them believe for 5 years. It was safer that way. It was the perfect cover. They did not know that dropping out of that coding boot camp was not a failure, it was a recruitment. They did not know that for the past 5 years I had not been unemployed. I had been working in stealth mode. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Core, a boutique cybersecurity firm that existed entirely off the grid. We had zero public footprint because our clients did not want the public to know we existed. My company specialized in building closed-loop quantum-resistant encryption architectures. We built digital fortresses. And my mother, the woman Richard claimed was senile, was the only person in the family who knew the truth. When my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, she called me to the hospital. She had spent decades watching Richard use his financial leverage to control her, to control Audrey, and to try and control me. She knew that when she died, Richard would immediately attempt to seize her personal assets and fold them back into his empire. She also knew that Aegis Core was on the verge of a massive breakthrough but desperately needed capital to finalize a prototype for a government bid. Take it, she had whispered from her hospital bed, gripping my hand with surprising strength, secretly signing the authorization forms. It is my money, Gwen, not his. Build your fortress. Make sure he can never touch you. That $500,000 was not a stolen inheritance. It was an angel investment, and I had used every single cent of it to finalize the source code for our latest defense system. The money was gone, transformed into lines of impenetrable code sitting on a secure server. When the car pulled up to my apartment building in South Boston, the rain had stopped. The building was exactly what Richard had described, a run-down brick structure with a flickering streetlight out front. I paid. The driver walked up 3 flights of creaky stairs and unlocked the door to Unit 4. B. Inside the apartment was sparse, a cheap futon, a tiny television, and empty takeout boxes on the counter. It looked exactly like the habitat of a depressed, unemployed 30-something. I locked the deadbolt. Then I walked to the hallway closet, pushed past the hanging winter coats, and pressed my thumb against a biometric scanner concealed behind the baseboard. A quiet click echoed in the small space. The back panel of the closet popped open, revealing a reinforced steel door. I stepped through the door into the adjacent combined apartment unit 4C, which I had secretly purchased through a blind trust 2 years ago. This room looked nothing like the one I just left. The air was cool and heavily climate-controlled. 3 massive curved monitors dominated a custom-built workstation, displaying cascading lines of encrypted data network traffic maps and server health diagnostics. Server racks hummed quietly in the corner, bathed in the blue glow of indicator lights. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair and woke up the main terminal. A secure messaging application flashed on the screen. It was a message from David, my attorney and the lead legal counsel for Aegis Corps. He was a former military lawyer who understood the high-stakes game we were playing better than anyone else. I typed in my decryption key and opened his message. David informed me that he had just reviewed the emergency motion Richard filed. My father was moving incredibly fast using his heavyweight corporate connections to bypass standard judicial waiting periods. He had successfully executed an ex parte order to freeze my public checking and savings accounts. I opened a separate browser window and logged into my retail bank portal. A bright red banner immediately warned me that my assets were locked pending a court order. I looked at the frozen balance, $412.16. I actually smiled at the screen. Richard had just leveraged decades of legal goodwill and called in massive favors to freeze the equivalent of a grocery run. He thought he was cutting off my oxygen. He thought he was leaving me destitute and desperate. He had no idea that those accounts were nothing but a decoy meant to feed his exact narrative of me being a failure. I replied to David, telling him I was on my way to the facility. I powered down the monitors, locked the reinforced steel door behind me, and exited through the fake closet back into the dreary studio apartment. I grabbed a heavy raincoat and walked out into the damp Boston evening. I did not take a direct route. I walked 3 blocks, caught a city bus, rode it for 10 minutes, and then transferred to a subway line. When dealing with a desperate man like Malik or a ruthless litigator like my father, you never assume you are unobserved. I finally emerged in a sterile corporate park on the outskirts of the city. The building looked like a mundane logistics company from the outside. There were no signs indicating that this was a sensitive, compartmented information facility. I badged in through 2 layers of physical security and surrendered my mobile phone to the armed guard at the front desk. I proceeded down a windowless corridor until I reached the secure conference room. David was already there reviewing a thick stack of printed documents. At 55 years old, he maintained the rigid posture of a man who had spent his prime years in uniform. He looked up as I entered and slid a file across the table. "Your father crossed a major line today," David said, his voice echoing slightly in the soundproofed room. He convinced a judge to grant an emergency asset freeze based on entirely circumstantial evidence. He claimed you were an immediate flight risk who was preparing to offshore stolen family trust funds. It is a blatant abuse of process. I can have this order thrown out by tomorrow morning, and we can file a counter motion for judicial sanctions against him. I took a seat opposite him and shook my head. No. Let the freeze stand. I want Richard to think his intimidation tactics are working. If you fight the freeze right now, he will realize I have competent legal representation. He expects me to be represented by a cheap public defender or no one at all. We need him to remain blinded by his own arrogance. David leaned back in his chair, observing me carefully. You are playing a dangerous game, Gwen. Richard is demanding a full accounting of that $500,000. He is going to subpoena your electronic devices next. He wants your hard drives, your laptops, and your communication logs. He is looking for a crypto wallet or an offshore bank routing number. That is exactly what I am counting on, I replied. Have we received the final confirmation from the Department of Defense? A rare smile broke through David and his stoic expression. He opened a separate red folder and tapped the top page. Yes. Aegis Core officially passed Level 6 clearance this morning. The Pentagon penetration testers spent 72 hours trying to crack the prototype using their most advanced quantum computing assets. They failed. The architecture held perfectly. The generals are ecstatic. They do not just want to license the technology, Gwen. They want to buy the entire system outright. We are moving into the final acquisition phase. I let out a slow breath. The money my mother had given me, the money Richard was currently tearing the family apart over, was now fully integrated into a classified military defense project. It was no longer just capital, it was national security infrastructure. So what happens when my father demands to audit my company? I asked, knowing the answer, but wanting to hear my lawyer outline the trap. David laced his fingers together. Aegis Core is now protected under the National Security Act. Your source code, your servers, and your hardware are classified assets. If Richard or anyone else attempts to forcefully access your data without federal authorization, they will trigger an immediate cybersecurity tripwire. It would be considered an act of cyber espionage against the United States government. I thought about Malik. I thought about the sheer desperation in his eyes when he cornered me in the cemetery parking lot. He was drowning in debt from his fraudulent investment fund. He was arrogant enough to think he could outsmart anyone and desperate enough to take extreme risks. If Richard managed to legally seize my decoy electronics, Malik would undoubtedly try to hack them to find the missing money. We are going to let them dig their own grave, I told David. Let Richard file his subpoenas. Let him drag me into a deposition and parade his fake evidence. When he demands my laptop, we will put up a token fight, but ultimately we will hand it over. We will give them a heavily monitored terminal that connects to a quarantined server. David raised an eyebrow. You want to hand classified hardware over to a hostile party? I want to hand them a bait car, I corrected. We will load my old laptop with a warning. A very clear, legally binding federal non-disclosure agreement. If they choose to ignore the warning and attempt to breach the firewall to find the money, they will activate the tracking protocol. They think I am a helpless child they can bully into submission. They are going to find out what happens when you try to bully a defense contractor. David nodded slowly, writing a note on his legal pad. Richard is going to use every dirty trick he knows. He will bring Audrey to the deposition. He will try to assassinate your character and paint you as a monster. He wants to break you psychologically before the trial even begins. I thought about my mother. I thought about how she had suffered in silence while Richard controlled every aspect of her life. She had given me the key to my freedom with her final breaths. I was not going to break. I was going to be the absolute destruction of his legacy. Let them do their worst, I said, my voice steady and cold. I have spent my entire life playing the part of the disappointment. I can play the victim for a few more weeks. Prepare the bait laptop, David. And let my father schedule the deposition. It is time to let the wolves into the trap. I left David with a final nod of agreement, stepping out into the crisp night air. The city lights of Boston smeared across the wet pavement as I made my way back to the decoy apartment. I knew Richard would not wait long to escalate his attacks. He was a man who believed in overwhelming force, a strategy designed to break an opponent psychologically before they ever stepped foot in a courtroom. I just did not anticipate that he would deploy my sister Audrey as his primary weapon of mass destruction to completely ruin my public reputation and entire life. 2 days later, the digital bombardment began. I was sitting at my cheap kitchen island drinking black coffee when my decoy smartphone vibrated violently against the laminate countertop. It was a notification from a former college roommate I had not spoken to in 4 years. The message simply read, "How could you do that to your own family?" Before I could process the accusation, another text arrived from my aunt in Chicago calling me a disgrace to my mother and her memory. Then came another and another. My phone became literally a rapid-fire metronome of incoming hatred from everywhere. I checked the social media algorithms to see what happened. It did not take very long to find the primary source of the sudden outrage. Audrey had secured a guest spot on Unfiltered Truths, one of the most popular lifestyle and true crime podcasts in the country. The host was highly notorious for conducting extremely sympathetic interviews with wealthy influencers, framing their minor inconveniences as monumental tragedies. Audrey was playing her role with Oscar-worthy precision, shedding fake tears and acting completely devastated by the terrible things she claimed I had purposely done to our poor mother during her illness. I clicked on the video link and watched my sister perform. She was sitting in a completely soundproof studio, wearing a tastefully oversized cashmere sweater, looking strategically exhausted. Her makeup was minimal, entirely designed to strictly convey raw vulnerability. The host leaned forward, asking how Audrey was coping with her recent devastating loss. Audrey let out a shaky breath, perfectly timing a single tear to roll down her cheek. She looked directly into the high-definition camera and began to smoothly weave a brilliant masterpiece of intense character assassination, aiming to completely destroy my reputation forever, without any hesitation whatsoever. "It has been a total nightmare," Audrey said, her voice trembling heavily. "Losing my sweet mother to cancer was hard enough, but discovering that my older sister Gwen took advantage of her during her final days has completely shattered our family." She paused, pressing a tissue to her eye. "My sister has struggled with reality for a long time. She dropped out of school. She refuses to work. We tried to help her for years, but instead of getting a job, she waited until my mother was heavily medicated and confused. She manipulated a dying woman into signing away money. She stole $500,000 that was meant to keep our family business afloat." The host gasped, pressing a hand to her chest in performative shock. Audrey continued, detailing how this stolen money was supposed to save her cosmetics brand and secure her husband and his investment fund. She painted a clear picture of me as a calculating sociopath who lurked in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She described my cheap apartment as a dangerous drug den, implying I was directly funding illicit habits with our mother and her life savings, without any guilt whatsoever. The podcast episode was proudly titled "The Ultimate Betrayal: When Blood Steals from the Dying." It already had over 2 million views. The fallout was instantaneous and absolute. My inbox quickly flooded with intense vitriol from distant relatives who had never even bothered to visit my mother once during her illness. People I went to high school with left extremely nasty comments on my abandoned social media profiles. Malik shared the podcast clip on his professional network, adding a lengthy caption about the extreme importance of protecting vulnerable seniors from financial abuse, which was incredibly hypocritical given his own massive debts. The hypocrisy was staggering, considering his own fund was actively hemorrhaging money and facing imminent collapse. I sat there quietly watching the view count steadily climb. In a normal family, this level of public shaming would certainly be a catastrophic blow. It was completely designed to forcefully trigger a quick surrender. Richard knew that most people would naturally crumble under the heavy weight of nationwide humiliation. They would easily hand over the money just to make the relentless public attacks completely stop. He was heavily relying on shame to completely break my spirit and force my immediate compliance now. I picked up my phone. I did not block the numerous numbers. I did not delete the hurtful messages or deactivate my accounts. I simply turned the volume all the way down and carefully placed the device face down on the counter. The harsh opinions of people who only cared about Audrey and her carefully curated narrative meant absolutely nothing to me. They were blindly screaming into a dark void. I stood up, walked steadily to the hallway closet, and firmly pressed my right thumb against the biometric scanner. The heavy steel door smoothly unlatched with a satisfying metallic clunk. I stepped out of the pathetic life my family thought I lived and enthusiastically entered the climate-controlled server room of Aegis Core. The low hum of the massive cooling units instantly washed away the toxic noise of the outside world. I sat down at my primary workstation and quickly woke the curved monitors. While Audrey was busy crying for extra views and Richard was busy drafting aggressive subpoenas, I had $1 billion defense contract to completely finalize. The Pentagon had requested a final severe stress test on the quantum encryption protocols before the huge final purchase was finalized. Across the city in the heart of the Boston financial district, Malik sat behind a massive mahogany desk, staring at two vastly different financial ledgers on his computer screens. His office on the 40th floor of a sleek glass skyscraper projected an image of absolute wealth and invincible corporate stability. The walls were lined with abstract art, and his shelves displayed various awards for financial innovation. But beneath the bespoke tailored suit and the expensive cologne, Malik was sweating profusely. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his desk, staring at the catastrophic numbers glaring back at him in bright red font. His boutique investment firm Vanguard Zenith was not a revolutionary financial powerhouse. It was a spectacular, carefully orchestrated illusion. It was a massive Ponzi scheme, and it was completely falling apart. For the past 5 years, Malik had courted wealthy clients, promising them guaranteed double-digit returns regardless of market volatility. He had charmed doctors, executives, and local politicians into handing over their life savings. He paid his early investors, using the fresh capital injected by new investors, pocketing a massive percentage to fund his lavish lifestyle and his wife and her failing cosmetics brand. But the well of new money had suddenly run completely dry. The market had shifted, and several major institutional clients had submitted formal requests to withdraw their capital by the end of the fiscal quarter. Worse still, an internal compliance auditor had flagged several irregularities in the fund and her reporting history. Malik had managed to delay the audit twice by falsifying documents, but his excuses had officially run out. He needed liquidity immediately. He needed $500,000 of untraceable clean cash to plug the gaping hole in his primary ledger and fake a margin call. If he could just inject that specific amount, he could easily buy himself another 6 months to find a new target and keep the house of cards standing. That was exactly why he had spent months grooming his dying mother-in-law. Catherine had an untouchable private trust fund, and Malik had convinced Audrey that they deserved it to expand her beauty empire. He had planned to quietly divert the entire $500,000 into Vanguard Zenith the moment Catherine passed away. It was his ultimate lifeline. It was his get-out-of-jail-free card. But Gwen had swooped in and ruined everything. By taking that money, Gwen had not just insulted his pride. She had essentially signed his federal prison sentence. The heavy glass door to his office swung open without a knock. Audrey marched in, staring intently at her smartphone screen. She looked completely energized, feeding off the toxic validation of her recent podcast appearance. "Did you see the metrics, Malik?" she asked, excitedly, pacing across the imported Persian rug. "The interview has over 3 million views across all platforms. People are absolutely tearing Gwen apart in the comment section. My follower count jumped by 40,000 just this morning. The public is totally on our side. We are controlling the entire narrative perfectly." Malik forced his facial muscles to relax, burying his absolute panic behind a mask of supportive husbandly pride. He stood up and walked around the desk, wrapping his arms around her waist. "That is incredible, babe," he said, forcing a smooth smile. "You were brilliant on camera. You made everyone see exactly who she really is. A manipulative thief who took advantage of a sick woman." Audrey leaned into his embrace, sighing dramatically. "I just cannot believe she is being so stubborn. My cosmetics suppliers are starting to ask questions about our outstanding invoices. We need that bridge capital to launch the new holiday collection, Malik. When is my father going to actually get the money back from her? We cannot afford to wait months for a trial." "That is exactly what I have been thinking," Malik lied smoothly, using her vanity to mask his own desperate criminal liability. "Your father is a brilliant litigator, but the legal system moves incredibly slow. Freezing her public checking accounts was a good start, but it is barely a slap on the wrist. She is obviously hiding the $500,000 in an offshore account or a cryptocurrency wallet. She dropped out of a coding program, Audrey." She knows how to hide digital assets. We need to escalate the pressure right now. We need to completely break her so she hands over the decryption keys before the end of the month. Audrey looked up at him, her eyes narrowing with sudden determination. You are right. Freezing $400 is a joke. She is probably sitting in that disgusting apartment laughing at us. What should we do? Go talk to your father. Malik instructed, his voice low and urgent. Tell him your business is suffering because of her theft. Cry if you have to. You make him realize that every day Gwen holds on to that money is another day she humiliates the family legacy. We need him to file emergency injunctions to physically seize her electronics. But before he does that, we need to pay her a little visit ourselves. We need to show her that she cannot hide behind a cheap lock in South Boston. An hour later, Malik pushed his way into the lavish corner office of his father-in-law. Richard was sitting at his desk swirling a glass of expensive scotch, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He pointed his glass at Malik as he entered. Have you seen the banking reports? Richard boasted. The girl has absolute pennies to her name. She is completely paralyzed. It is not enough, Richard Malik said, slamming his hands down on the polished wood surface. He could no longer hide the raw urgency in his tone. She moved $500,000 in liquid cash. It did not just vanish into thin air. She is holding it on a hard drive or a hidden server. Your asset freeze is a minor inconvenience to someone who knows how to operate on the dark web. We are running out of time. Richard frowned, offended by the sudden disrespect. I am moving exactly as the law allows, Malik. I am suffocating her legally. We do not have time for standard procedure, Malik snapped, leaning closer to the older man. Audrey is distressed. Her suppliers are threatening to cut off her inventory. Your daughter needs that money to save her company right now. You need to file a motion to confiscate every laptop, phone, and digital storage device in her possession. And while you draft that motion, Audrey and I are going to pay Gwen a personal visit. We are going to remind her exactly who she is dealing with and make sure she understands that this lawsuit is not going to go away. We are going to squeeze her until she breaks. Actually, I am coming with you, Malik, Richard said, standing up and adjusting his expensive silk tie. Audrey is too emotional for this type of confrontation. If we are going to squeeze your sister, I want to be the one applying the pressure. She needs to see that the full weight of my legal authority is standing right inside her pathetic living room. Malik nodded in agreement, hiding his immense relief. Having a senior corporate litigator present would completely terrify Gwen into submission. They left the towering glass skyscraper and ordered a luxury black car to take them deep into South Boston. The ride was silent and tense. Richard stared out the tinted window with absolute disgust as the pristine downtown streets slowly transitioned into crumbling brick facades and graffiti-covered alleyways. He could not fathom how any daughter of his could choose to live in such a miserable environment. Malik simply checked his expensive watch, calculating how quickly he could wire the hidden funds once they broke her spirit. The black car idled at the curb, while the two men stepped out into the damp street. They walked up the 3 flights of creaky stairs, their polished leather shoes echoing loudly in the narrow stairwell. Inside Unit 4B, I was sitting on my cheap futon, eating a bowl of instant noodles. The hidden steel door leading to my advanced server room was completely locked and secured behind the baseboard. I heard heavy footsteps stop directly outside my front door. A loud, aggressive knock rattled the thin wood. I did not move immediately. I let them knock again, louder this time. Gwen, open this door right now! Richard bellowed, his voice easily penetrating the cheap walls. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump and arranging my facial features into a mask of pure exhaustion and fear. I opened the door just a crack, leaving the chain engaged. What do you want? I asked, my voice trembling perfectly. Open the door, Gwen, Richard ordered, glaring down at me. We are coming inside to have a serious conversation about your future. I hesitated, playing the part of a terrified victim. I fumbled with the chain, making my hands shake visibly before pulling the door wide open. Richard and Malik pushed past me immediately, invading my small decoy apartment. They stood in the center of the cramped living room, looking around with undisguised revulsion. "Is this really how you live?" Richard asked, swiping a finger across the dusty kitchen counter. "It smells like stale grease and failure in here. Your mother would be absolutely disgusted to see what you have become." I wrapped my arms around myself, looking down at the worn carpet. "Please leave," I whispered, trying to sound small and defenseless. "I do not want any trouble." "You brought the trouble on yourself," Malik said, stepping uncomfortably close to me. He loomed over my small frame, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. "You thought you were so incredibly smart taking that money, but you are just a stupid college dropout playing a game you do not understand. My fund needs that capital back today, Gwen. If you transfer the money right now, we will walk away. If you do not, we are going to destroy you." I backed away until my shoulders hit the wall. "I do not have the money readily available," I stammered, letting my voice crack. "It is tied up. It takes time to move things around." Richard laughed a cold and calculated sound. "Tied up in what? Cryptocurrency. Some pathetic offshore account. You are not a criminal mastermind, Gwen. You are just a thief. And thieves go to federal prison. I am drafting a motion tonight to confiscate every single electronic device in your possession. Your laptop, your phone, any digital storage you have hidden in this miserable dump. The judge will grant the emergency injunction by tomorrow afternoon. Once I have your hard drives, I will find the routing numbers. I will find the encryption keys. And then I will have the district attorney charge you with grand larceny and elder abuse." I let out a loud, choked sob, covering my face with my hands. "Please do not do that," I begged, pushing out real tears of fake desperation. "I need my laptop. It has all my personal files. You cannot just take my things. I am barely surviving here." Malik smiled, exchanging a triumphant look with my father. They were completely feeding off my manufactured misery. Their massive egos were swelling with every fake tear I shed. They truly believed they had utterly broken me. "You have 24 hours," Gwen Malik said, pointing a sharp finger at my chest. "Transfer the entire $500,000 to my corporate account by noon tomorrow. If you make the transfer, we will drop the lawsuit completely. We will let you stay in this pathetic little bubble and rot in peace. But if that money is not in my ledger by lunchtime, Richard will send the authorities to rip this place apart. They will take your computers, and you will spend the next 10 years sitting in a concrete cell." I nodded frantically, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders hunched. "I will figure something out," I whispered, wiping my eyes. "Just please do not send the police. Just give me a little bit of time to get the digital wallets sorted out." Richard scoffed, straightening his suit jacket. "You have until tomorrow at noon. Do not test my patience again." He turned and walked out the front door without looking back. Malik lingered for 1 second longer, giving me a look of absolute disgust, before following my father into the hallway. The door slammed shut behind them, rattling the entire frame. I stood perfectly still, listening to their heavy footsteps fade down the stairwell. Once I heard the black car pull away from the curb, I wiped the fake tears from my cheeks. I stopped shaking. I stood up perfectly straight and smiled. They took the bait exactly as I wanted. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed a rag to wipe down the counter where Richard had run his finger. My hands were perfectly steady now. I disposed of the cold noodles in the trash and retrieved my secure phone from the hidden compartment in the wall. I sent a single encrypted message to David. The message simply read that the fish were in the barrel and to prepare for an aggressive filing by morning. David responded 2 minutes later, confirming that the bait laptop was fully configured and ready for deployment at his office. The next morning, I watched the clock on my wall tick closer to noon. I did not check banking portals. I did not transfer a single cent to Malik and his fraudulent investment fund. At exactly 12 o'clock, I made a cup of coffee and waited for the inevitable legal explosion. It took under 2 hours. A loud, sharp knock echoed through the hallway. A process server was standing outside my door holding a thick manila envelope. He handed me the emergency motion and walked away without a word. Richard had truly outdone himself. The document was a masterclass in aggressive corporate litigation. He had filed an emergency injunction in federal court, demanding the immediate seizure of all my electronic devices. The motion claimed I was operating a sophisticated cryptocurrency laundering scheme using the stolen $500,000 from my late mother. Richard painted a picture of a flight risk who was moments away from moving assets to untraceable offshore ledgers. Because of his immense influence and the manufactured urgency, the judge had scheduled an emergency preliminary hearing for early the following morning. I met David at the courthouse an hour before the hearing. We sat in a small consultation room reviewing the strategy. David handed me a sleek silver laptop resting inside a clear evidence bag. "This is the device," David explained, tapping the plastic. "It looks like a standard high-end machine. It has dummy files, fake email accounts, and a web browser history that perfectly matches a struggling freelance designer. But hidden deep within the system registry is the payload. If anyone attempts to bypass the firewall or plug this machine into an external network, it will immediately ping the Department of Defense servers. It will flag the intrusion as a Level 6 security breach and initiate a reverse trace." I placed my hand on the bag. "And you are sure they will try to hack it?" David smiled a tight, grim expression. "Your father is too arrogant to wait for a court-appointed forensic analyst, and Malik is too desperate to let anyone else find the money first. They will bypass legal protocol. They always do." We walked into the courtroom together. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. Richard was already seated at the plaintiff table flanking a junior associate who was carrying his briefcase. Audrey and Malik sat in the gallery right behind him. Malik looked pale, his leg bouncing anxiously under the wooden bench. When the judge entered, we all stood. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with decades of experience, looked over the emergency filing and frowned at our table. "Counsel," the judge began, addressing David directly. "These are very serious allegations. Your client is accused of misappropriating $500,000 from a dying woman and actively hiding those funds in decentralized digital wallets. The plaintiff is requesting the immediate confiscation of all computers, smartphones, and external hard drives to prevent the destruction of evidence." David stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He launched into a brilliant performance of fake legal desperation. He argued vehemently against the seizure, claiming it was a gross violation of my privacy and a blatant overreach by a grieving father. He gestured passionately, pointing out that Richard had provided absolutely zero concrete proof of any cryptocurrency accounts. David acted like a lawyer who was completely terrified of his client losing her only means of communication and livelihood. It was exactly the kind of panicked resistance Richard expected us to mount. Richard stood up, his voice booming across the room. "Your Honor, my daughter is a flight risk with a history of erratic behavior. If she retains possession of those devices for even one more night, that money will vanish forever. I am simply trying to preserve the estate of my late wife." The judge held up a hand, silencing them both. "Given the substantial amount of money involved and the timing of the transfer, I am inclined to grant the plaintiff a limited seizure order to preserve the evidence." David slumped his shoulders, letting out a heavy theatrical sigh. He looked at me with a perfectly feigned expression of defeat. "Your Honor," David said, his voice tight with manufactured frustration, "if the court is going to order the surrender of my client and her primary computer, we request a strict protective order. We have the laptop right here in our possession. But before we hand it over to the plaintiff legal team, they must sign a chain of custody agreement. We require a binding legal acknowledgement that the plaintiff assumes all liability for any unauthorized access or tampering with this device prior to a court-appointed forensic review." Richard laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. He leaned over and whispered something to his junior associate, who smirked. "We will happily sign a chain of custody document, Your Honor," Richard said smoothly. We have no intention of tampering with the device. We just want it secured. The judge nodded. Draft the protective order, counsel. The defendant will surrender the laptop immediately upon signature. David pulled a prepared document from his briefcase. Richard barely glanced at the warnings before slashing his signature across the bottom line. He was blinded by hubris. He thought he outsmarted us. David handed over the clear bag containing the laptop. Malik stared from the gallery with hungry anticipation. Court adjourned. We left the courtroom, leaving them the ultimate Trojan horse. 2 weeks later, the legal theater moved from the grand federal courthouse to a sterile, glass-walled conference room inside Richard and his massive corporate law firm. The pre-trial deposition was designed to gather sworn testimony before a judge ever heard the full case. It was also designed to be incredibly intimidating. The room smelled of expensive espresso and polished leather. The air conditioning was turned down freezing cold, a classic intimidation tactic meant to make opposing parties physically uncomfortable. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the entire Boston skyline loomed like a backdrop to Richard and his immense ego. A certified court reporter sat at the head of the long oak table, her fingers resting lightly on her stenography machine. David and I sat on one side of the massive table. Richard, Audrey, and Malik sat opposite us. Malik was practically vibrating with nervous energy, his eyes darting between my empty hands and his own glowing smartphone screen. He thought they had already won by seizing my bait laptop last week, but the quantum encryption was clearly holding his hired hackers off. Now they needed to build the airtight narrative of my guilt to force a settlement. The court reporter administered the formal oath. Richard stood up, straightening his designer tie, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He sat down and immediately began to construct a masterpiece of absolute perjury. Under David and his calm, methodical questioning, Richard painted a devastatingly false picture of my relationship with my mother. My daughter Gwen has not held a steady job in 5 years. Richard stated, his voice resonating with fake paternal heartbreak. She dropped out of a coding program and has been living in squalor. My late wife Catherine was a generous woman, but her kindness was relentlessly exploited. Gwen constantly demanded money for rent, for groceries, for fictional business ventures that never ever materialized. David leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished oak table. You are testifying under oath that your daughter actively demanded funds from her mother on a regular basis. Yes, Richard replied without a single second of hesitation. It was a constant financial drain on our family trust. I tried to intervene multiple times, but Catherine was simply too sick and medicated to see the gross manipulation. David nodded slowly, his expression completely unreadable. And you have personal knowledge of these constant demands. You witnessed them firsthand. Richard smiled, a cold, predatory smirk that did not reach his eyes. I saw the aftermath. The missing funds. The emotional toll it took on my poor wife. It was financial abuse, plain and simple. Please make sure the record reflects that exact statement, David said, directing his gaze to the court reporter. The stenographer typed silently, capturing every single lie. I sat beside David, keeping my face completely blank. Inside, I was marveling at Richard and his staggering arrogance. He was so incredibly confident in his own power that he felt completely comfortable committing federal perjury on the official legal record. Next, it was Audrey and her turn to testify. She swapped places with Richard, smoothing down her designer skirt and offering the court reporter a practiced influencer smile. Audrey had come completely prepared to destroy me. She opened a sleek leather folder and dramatically slid a thick stack of printed papers across the table toward David. These are bank statements from my mother and her private checking account. Audrey said, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical sorrow. I managed her personal finances during her final months because she was too weak to do it herself. You will see dozens of transfers. $500 here, $1,000 there, all going directly to Gwen. My sister was bleeding our mother dry long before she stole the final $500,000. David picked up the papers and adjusted his reading glasses. He scanned the highlighted lines. The documents clearly showed transfers from Catherine to my accounts. What Audrey failed to mention, and what she had clearly doctored the context of, was that these were not random handouts. They were reimbursements. My mother had been quietly paying my cybersecurity firm to audit her personal devices because she suspected Richard was actively tracking her private communications. The money was for encrypted hardware and secure servers to protect her privacy from her own husband. Audrey had manipulated the ledger to make professional security invoices look like desperate pleas for allowance money. David placed the papers back on the table. He did not object to the fake evidence. He did not call Audrey a liar. He simply locked the trap. Miss Audrey. David asked, his voice perfectly polite. Are you testifying today that you personally reviewed these specific bank statements and verified their complete authenticity? Yes, I am, Audrey said, lifting her chin defiantly. I am the one who found them. I printed them out myself. It broke my heart to see how much Gwen was leeching off our dying mother, while Malik and I were working so hard to build our honest businesses. And to your knowledge, these documents have not been altered or taken out of context in any way, David pressed, ensuring the question was crystal clear for the transcript. They are exactly as I found them, Audrey lied, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. They prove that Gwen is a financial parasite. David looked at the court reporter. Please mark these bank statements as Plaintiff Exhibit B. He then looked at me and gave a microscopic nod. The strategy was working perfectly. By introducing manipulated financial documents into a sworn federal deposition, Audrey had just committed fraud. She thought she was building an insurmountable mountain of evidence against me. In reality, she was handing us the exact rope we needed to hang her. Malik watched the exchange with hungry satisfaction. He leaned over and whispered something into Audrey, and her ear causing her to smile triumphantly. They were utterly convinced that this deposition was the final nail in my coffin. They believed that by creating this overwhelming wave of fake evidence, I would simply collapse and hand over the decryption keys to the stolen $500,000. David flipped to a new page on his legal pad. He was deliberately giving them enough rope to incriminate themselves beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt. He looked back at Richard, who was currently checking his expensive watch, clearly bored with the proceedings and eager to get to the final kill. We have established your claims regarding the financial history, David said, his voice shifting to a slightly sharper tone. Let us move on to the core of your lawsuit, the final wire transfer. You claim your late wife was not of sound mind when she authorized the transfer of $500,000 to my client. Richard sat up straight, his eyes gleaming with malicious anticipation. He reached for his own briefcase. That is correct, counselor. And I brought the medical proof to guarantee it. Richard unclasped the brass latches of his briefcase with a sharp, satisfying click. He reached inside and extracted a thick file folder marked with the logo of a prominent Boston oncology clinic. He dropped it onto the center of the table with a heavy thud. Malik leaned forward, his eyes locked on the folder like a starving man looking at a feast, while Audrey crossed her arms, a smug smile dancing on her lips. David did not flinch. He slowly reached out and opened the folder, his eyes scanning the top document. I sat perfectly still beside him, waiting for the trap to spring shut. These are the certified medical evaluations from my late wife and her attending physician, Dr. Aris Thorne. Richard announced, his voice echoing in the chilled conference room. You will see detailed notes covering her final 6 weeks of life. The records clearly state that the heavy doses of morphine and palliative care medications caused severe cognitive decline. By the time that wire transfer was initiated, Catherine was suffering from medically induced dementia. She lacked the legal capacity to authorize a transfer of $5, let alone $500,000. David turned the page, reading silently. I knew exactly what Dr. Thorne and his actual records said because my mother had shared them with me. She had been weak, yes, but her mind was razor sharp until the very last day. Richard had obviously found a physician willing to falsify documents for the right price, or he had completely fabricated the addendums himself. Either way, he was now submitting forged medical records into a federal deposition. You are presenting these records as absolute fact, David asked, peering over his glasses at my father. You are stating under oath that Dr. Thorne concluded your wife was legally incapacitated. I am stating that the medical evidence speaks for itself, Richard replied, leaning back in his leather chair and steepling his fingers. The documents are signed and dated. My daughter took advantage of a dying woman who did not even know her own name. It is disgusting, it is immoral, and it is a felony. I knew it was time to play my part. The trap was fully loaded with perjury-manipulated bank statements and now forged medical records. They had handed us enough federal crimes to put all three of them behind bars for a decade. All I needed to do was close the lid. I let my breath hitch. I forced my hands to start shaking, gripping the edge of the oak table so tightly my knuckles turned white. I lowered my head, letting my hair fall forward to hide my face as I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing hot tears to prick at the corners. No, I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. That is not true. She knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted me to have it. Audrey laughed, a harsh and grating sound in the quiet room. Oh, please, Gwen. Stop playing the victim. You have been caught. We have the bank statements. We have the medical records. You are a fraud. I let out a ragged sob, bringing my trembling hands up to cover my face. I slumped forward in my chair, projecting total and utter defeat. Through the gaps in my fingers, I could see Malik grinning. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery, completely unaware that he was standing on a landmine. David put a comforting hand on my shoulder, playing his role of the concerned, cornered attorney flawlessly. Gwen, take a breath. We will review these documents. There is nothing to review. Counselor Richard sneered, his voice dripping with triumphant venom. The deposition is over. The facts are on the table. My daughter is a common thief who exploited her own mother. The only thing left to discuss is how quickly she intends to surrender the decryption keys to whatever offshore account she is hiding the money in. I kept my face buried in my hands, letting out another loud, pathetic sob. I rocked back and forth slightly, channeling every ounce of acting ability I possessed. Please, I gasped out, my voice muffled. Please just leave me alone. I do not have the money anymore. I cannot give it back to you. Malik slammed his hand on the table, his fake composure finally cracking under the weight of his massive financial desperation. Do not play games with us, Gwen. We seized your laptop last week. Our forensic guys are cracking it as we speak. We are going to find the routing numbers. But if you make us wait, Richard is going to press criminal charges. You will go to prison. Just hand over the keys and we will let you crawl back to your miserable little life. David stood up, gathering his legal pads with a look of manufactured frustration. This deposition is concluded for today. My client is clearly in distress. We will review Exhibit C, the medical records, and we will be in touch with your office regarding our next steps. Richard stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with a look of absolute supreme victory. He looked down at me, a pathetic sobbing mess huddled at the defense table. He had won. He had crushed his disappointment of a daughter. He had secured the funds to save his golden child and her husband. He was the master of his universe. Take all the time you need, David, Richard said, his voice smooth and deadly. But be aware that every day you delay, my patience wears thinner. I want that $500,000 back in the family trust by Friday. If I do not have it, I am handing these forged transfer documents over to the district attorney. Audrey stood up and linked her arm through Malik, and his arm looking down at me with pure disgust. You always were a failure, Gwen. It is honestly pathetic that you thought you could outsmart Dad. Let us go, Malik. The smell in here is making me sick. Malik adjusted his tie, his eyes lingering on my shaking form. Friday, Gwen. Or you are done. They turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving the door wide open. Their footsteps echoed down the marble hallway, fading into the distance along with their arrogant laughter. I stayed hunched over the table for another full minute, listening to the silence of the law firm. When I was absolutely certain they were gone, I stopped crying. My shoulders stopped shaking. I lowered my hands from my face, picked up a napkin, and calmly dabbed the fake tears from my cheeks. I looked over at David, who was already securing the forged medical records in his briefcase. They took it all, David said quietly, shaking his head in disbelief. Perjury fraud submitting forged medical records to a federal court. They handed us the entire arsenal. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my black blazer. My face was completely devoid of emotion, the terrified victim act discarded the moment they left the room. They think they have me backed into a corner, I said, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Boston skyline. They think they hold all the cards. David snapped his briefcase shut. Richard thinks he is the smartest man in the city. He has no idea what is waiting for him on that laptop. I smiled, a cold, calculating expression. Malik just admitted on the record that his team is actively trying to crack the laptop we surrendered. They are attempting to bypass a Level 6 Department of Defense firewall. By this time tomorrow, the Pentagon will have a complete map of Malik and his entire fraudulent network. Let us go home, David. The trial is going to be spectacular. The very next morning, we arrived at the independent forensic lab chosen by my father. The court order from the preliminary hearing stipulated that the physical transfer of my electronic devices for data extraction must occur in a neutral setting. Richard and Malik were already standing in the sterile, brightly lit lobby. They looked like predators circling a wounded animal. Malik was practically salivating, staring at the locked metal briefcase David carried. He thought that briefcase held the keys to his salvation. He thought it contained the routing numbers to $500,000 that would magically rescue his failing investment fund from a massive federal audit. We walked into a private glass-walled meeting room. An independent forensic technician stood by a stainless steel table, ready to receive the evidence. Richard adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked down his nose at David. "Let us get this over with," Richard commanded, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "My forensic team is standing by to image the drive. We have wasted enough time indulging your client and her theatrical stalling tactics. Hand over the machine so we can finally locate the stolen funds and put this miserable chapter behind us." David placed the metal briefcase on the steel table. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he snapped the latches open and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper covered in dense legal text. "Before the physical transfer of this specific hardware occurs," David said, his tone shifting into the rigid cadence of a military lawyer, "I have a supplementary chain of custody document that requires your immediate signature, Richard." Richard scoffed, rolling his eyes. "I already signed your ridiculous protective order in front of the judge last week. I am not playing any more of your amateur legal games. We are taking possession of the hardware right now." David did not flinch. He slid the paper across the cold steel table. "That was a standard evidence preservation order," David explained smoothly. "This is a Federal Information Security Management Act acknowledgement. The device inside this case contains proprietary software architecture. My client operates in a highly sensitive sector of the tech industry. This document strictly warns that any unauthorized attempt to bypass the root directory firewall or plug this machine into an unapproved network carries severe criminal penalties under federal law. You are permitted to image the public partitions. You are strictly forbidden from executing brute force decryption on the core operating system." Richard let out a loud, barking laugh. He looked at Malik, who was grinning widely. They both thought David was trying to protect a hidden cryptocurrency wallet with fake legal jargon. They thought the federal warnings were nothing but a desperate bluff from a cornered attorney trying to scare them off the scent of the money. "You are absolutely pathetic," Richard sneered, grabbing a silver pen from his breast pocket. "You think wrapping your stolen money in fake federal warnings is going to stop my analysts from cracking that drive? My daughter is a college dropout who lives in a slum. She does not possess proprietary software. She possesses $500,000 of my late wife and her money. You are trying to use big words to hide a common theft." Richard did not even bother to read the bold red text at the top of the page. He slashed his signature across the bottom line with aggressive, arrogant strokes. He pushed the paper toward Malik. "Sign it as the financial beneficiary," Richard ordered. "Let them pile on all the fake warnings they want. It just proves they are terrified of what we are going to find on that hard drive. Malik eagerly grabbed the pen. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from the intense adrenaline of impending wealth. He needed this money to hide his Ponzi scheme. He needed this cash to stop the auditors from discovering that his entire financial empire was a complete lie. He scribbled his name next to Richard and his signature, completely ignoring the explicit Department of Defense warning labels embedded in the watermark of the document. He tossed the pen onto the table with a loud clatter. "There," Malik said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We signed your scary piece of paper. Now open the box and give me the laptop. I need to get this to my office immediately. My tech guys are waiting to rip it apart." David picked up the signed document and carefully placed it into his leather portfolio. He ensured the ink was dry before sliding it away. He had just secured written sworn confirmation that they had been explicitly warned about the federal nature of the hardware. They had legally waived their right to claim ignorance in a court of law. David reached out and opened the metal briefcase. He lifted the sleek silver laptop and placed it on the stainless steel table. It looked entirely ordinary. A few scratches on the casing gave it the appearance of a cheap consumer-grade machine. It was anything but ordinary. It was a military-grade honeypot loaded with quantum tracking software. Malik snatched the laptop off the table, clutching it to his chest like a life preserver. He did not hand it to the independent forensic technician, waiting quietly in the corner. He had no intention of following the legal protocols of evidence handling. He intended to take it straight to his own corrupt tech team, to hack the passwords, and steal the funds he desperately needed to stay out of federal prison. "Do not leave town, Gwen," Richard said, offering me one final glare of absolute disgust. "I will have the warrant for your arrest drafted by tomorrow morning. You will rot in a cell for what you did." I kept my head bowed, playing the defeated victim one last time. I watched their polished shoes walk out the door. The Trojan horse was officially inside their gates. The heavy glass doors of the forensic laboratory slid shut behind my father and brother-in-law. Malik did not hand the silver laptop to the independent technician waiting by the sterile workbench. Instead, he tucked it tightly under his arm, like a prized football, and marched straight toward the parking garage. Richard followed close behind, barking orders into his mobile phone about drafting immediate criminal referrals. They slid into the back of Richard and his waiting luxury town car. The atmosphere inside the spacious vehicle was thick with greedy anticipation. Richard poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter in the center console. "We have her," Richard stated, swirling the amber liquid. "My forensic team will image that drive-by tomorrow morning. We will submit the decrypted financial ledgers to the judge by Friday, and I will personally see Gwen handcuffed before the weekend is over." Malik stared at the silver laptop resting on his knees. Friday was entirely too late. The internal auditors at Vanguard Zenith were scheduled to finalize their review of his primary fund on Thursday afternoon. If he did not inject $500,000 of untraceable liquidity into his accounts by tomorrow, his entire Ponzi scheme would violently collapse. Federal investigators would freeze his assets, and he would be facing decades in prison for massive wire fraud. He could not wait for Richard and his slow, methodical legal process. He needed the decryption keys today. Richard Malik set his voice tight with manufactured respect. "I think I should secure the device at my office vault for the afternoon. Your legal team is busy preparing for the trial, and your forensic experts are currently tied up in that corporate espionage case you mentioned yesterday. I have a secure climate-controlled safe at Vanguard Zenith. I can personally deliver it to your tech team first thing tomorrow morning." Richard frowned, taking a sip of his drink. "The court order specifies strict chain of custody, Malik." "I am the financial beneficiary of the lawsuit," Malik countered smoothly, tapping the signed federal document they had so arrogantly dismissed. "My signature is on the preservation order alongside yours. I am legally authorized to secure the asset." "Audrey is a wreck, Richard. She is terrified Gwen is going to remotely wipe the drive before we extract the data. Let me lock it inside a bank-grade vault today, so Audrey can finally sleep tonight." The mention of his golden child and her distress worked perfectly on Richard and his massive ego. He waved his hand dismissively. Fine. Take it to your office. Lock it up. But do not let anyone touch it until my team takes possession tomorrow at 9 sharp. Malik nodded, hiding a triumphant smirk. He had absolutely no intention of waiting for tomorrow. The town car dropped Malik off in the financial district. He bypassed his receptionist, ignoring the frantic stack of messages from angry investors demanding their delayed quarterly returns. He walked straight into his lavish corner office, locked the heavy mahogany door, and lowered the motorized blinds. He was completely alone. Malik placed the silver laptop on his massive desk. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. The walls of his financial empire were closing in. He opened the lid. The screen flickered to life, displaying a simple minimalist login screen asking for a password. There was no corporate logo, no security warning, just a blank white box. Malik smiled hungrily. He assumed Gwen had used a basic password protecting a standard digital wallet holding $500,000 in stolen cryptocurrency. He pulled out his personal burner phone and opened a highly encrypted messaging application. Malik did not plan to use Richard and his expensive legally bound forensic experts. Those experts would document every single cent they found and report it directly to the court. Malik needed to steal the funds silently and route them through a digital mixer to hide the origin before injecting them into his failing company. To do that, he needed a black market operative. He initiated a chat with a hacker known online as Cypher. Malik had used Cypher previously to falsify international bank statements and create dummy accounts to fool his early investors. Cypher was expensive, but fast, and completely unethical. Malik typed a rapid message explaining he had a physical machine containing a heavily encrypted crypto wallet that needed to be cracked immediately. He offered Cypher a $50,000 bonus for a turnaround time of under 3 hours. The hacker responded 2 minutes later. Cypher explained that brute forcing a local machine remotely required massive computational power. A standard wireless connection would be too slow and unstable to run the necessary decryption algorithms before Malik and his deadline. Cypher instructed Malik to bypass the wireless card entirely. The hacker explicitly ordered Malik to plug the laptop directly into a high-speed enterprise-grade network using a physical Ethernet cable. This would allow Cypher to hijack Vanguard Zenith and its massive bandwidth to hammer the laptop and its firewall with millions of password combinations per second. Malik did not hesitate. He was blinded by desperation and greed. He completely forgot the strict military warning David had forced him to sign just an hour earlier. He dismissed the federal document as a pathetic scare tactic deployed by a weak lawyer. He did not care about network security protocols. He only cared about saving his own skin from the impending financial audit. Malik opened a hidden panel on his desk, revealing the direct hardware link to his company and its primary servers. This was the central nervous system of Vanguard Zenith. It held every single falsified ledger, every fake client portfolio, and every shred of evidence proving his massive financial crimes. He grabbed a thick blue Ethernet cable. He plugged one end into his company mainframe. He picked up the other end and looked at the sleek silver laptop. He took a deep breath, dreaming of the $500,000 waiting just behind the glass screen. He imagined wiping his debts clean and walking into the courtroom to watch his wife gloat over her ruined sister. Malik pushed the cable firmly into the side port of Gwen and her laptop. The plastic connector clicked securely into place. A small green light illuminated next to the port, confirming the physical high-speed connection was successfully established. Malik leaned back in his leather chair and typed a quick message to the hacker, telling him the hardline was live and to begin the attack. He smiled, feeling the intoxicating rush of impending victory. He truly believed he had just outsmarted everyone. He thought he was breaking into a vulnerable digital vault holding a massive fortune. He had absolutely no idea that he had just opened the front door to a highly classified Department of Defense honeypot, and handed over the keys to his entire criminal existence. 300 miles away, inside a subterranean facility in Fort Meade, Maryland, a massive wall of monitors suddenly flashed from a dormant blue to a blinding crimson red. This was the headquarters of the National Security Agency. A senior cyber threat analyst spilled his coffee as a high-priority alert, klaxon echoed through the sterile command center. The automated defense systems had just detected a targeted brute force attack originating from a commercial internet protocol address in Boston. The target of the attack was not a random civilian computer. It was an Aegis Core prototype hardware unit carrying a Level 6 security clearance identifier. The analyst immediately locked his terminal and initiated the mandated containment protocols for a domestic cyber espionage event. He picked up a secure red telephone to notify the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Division that a hostile actor was actively attempting to breach a proprietary military asset. Back in his lavish corner office, Malik leaned back in his expensive leather chair and took a long sip of his aged scotch. On his personal burner phone, Cypher had just sent a message confirming that the decryption software was successfully deployed. A small digital progress bar appeared on Malik, and his screen slowly creeping past 1%. Malik smiled, feeling the heavy, crushing weight of his impending financial ruin finally beginning to lift off his shoulders. He watched the green light on the Ethernet cable blink rapidly. He assumed that blinking light meant Cypher was hammering the laptop firewall and cracking the code to the hidden $500,000. He was spectacularly wrong. That blinking green light was actually the Aegis Core self-defense protocol waking up. The laptop was not just sitting there passively taking the assault. It was actively fighting back. The software I had meticulously designed did not simply block unauthorized access attempts. It was engineered to completely neutralize the threat by mapping and archiving the attacker and their entire network infrastructure. The moment Cypher and his black market hacking tool sent the very first malicious data packet through the Ethernet cable, my software grabbed that packet, digitized a backdoor, and slipped right past Vanguard Zenith and its pathetic commercial-grade firewalls. Malik had plugged the Trojan horse directly into the central nervous system of his own company. The Aegis Core protocol silently flooded into his corporate mainframe. It moved with terrifying military precision. It completely bypassed the standard employee directories and headed straight for the encrypted administrative servers where Malik kept his darkest secrets. The reverse scan took less than 40 seconds to execute perfectly. The automated protocol ripped through the hidden partitions of the Vanguard Zenith network like a hurricane tearing through a paper house. It immediately located the dual financial ledgers Malik used to hide his massive market losses. It found the falsified client portfolios, the desperate offshore wire transfers, and the fake margin call reports. It gathered every single shred of digital evidence, proving that this boutique investment firm was nothing more than a spectacular Ponzi scheme built on absolute fraud. The protocol packaged these highly incriminating files into heavily encrypted data bursts and beamed them simultaneously to the secure servers at the National Security Agency and directly to my hidden terminal in South Boston. Malik remained blissfully ignorant of his total destruction. He checked his expensive gold watch, calculating how soon the transfer would complete. He picked up his phone and dialed Audrey. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with anxious anticipation. "Did you get the machine into the vault?" she asked quickly. "Are we going to get the money back from that lying thief today?" Malik chuckled, swirling the remaining scotch in his glass. "Relax, babe," he said smoothly. "I have my top security guys working on the extraction right now. The encryption is a little tricky, but we are already breaking through the outer layers. I should have the $500,000 routed back into the family trust by tonight. Once the funds are fully secured, your father can proceed with the criminal charges. We are going to completely destroy her." Audrey let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. "Thank goodness, Malik. I was so worried she would find a way to escape justice. Call me the exact second the transfer clears. I want to be the one to tell my father that we finally beat her." Malik promised to call her back and ended the connection feeling like a conquering king. Meanwhile, inside my climate-controlled server room in Unit 4C, I was sitting beside David watching my central monitor light up with incoming data streams. We had expected the laptop to simply log an intrusion attempt and capture the internet protocol address of the attacker. We had expected to catch Richard or Malik in the act of violating a federal preservation order. We did not expect to receive a complete comprehensive download of an ongoing massive financial crime syndicate. I watched the progress bar on my screen hit 100%. The sheer volume of criminal activity was staggering. There were fabricated wire transfers to offshore accounts and records of money being laundered through Audrey and her failing cosmetics brand. Malik had completely robbed his investors blind to fund their lavish lifestyle. David leaned closer to the screen, his eyes widening as the files automatically decrypted and populated my secondary monitor. "Are these financial ledgers?" David asked, pointing at a spreadsheet showing millions of dollars in fabricated client returns. I typed a rapid command, running a quick diagnostic on the incoming data cache. "Yes," I said, my voice flat with shock. He plugged the laptop directly into his company mainframe. "We just received the ultimate weapon to completely annihilate his entire life. The trial officially begins tomorrow in the morning." The morning light broke through the heavy clouds, casting long gray shadows across the polished marble steps of the federal courthouse. I stood beside David, holding a simple black briefcase that contained absolutely nothing of value. The real weapon was safely secured inside David and his locked leather portfolio. We walked through the metal detectors and rode the elevator to the fourth floor in complete silence. Today was the day Richard intended to publicly execute me. He had spent months orchestrating this exact moment, maneuvering the legal system to trap me in front of a jury of my peers. When we pushed open the heavy wooden doors to the courtroom, the atmosphere was already suffocating. Richard was standing at the plaintiff table, arranging his notes with the precise, confident movements of a man who believed he owned the entire building. He wore a dark navy suit that probably cost more than my decoy apartment. Audrey sat in the gallery directly behind him, wearing a conservative black dress designed to make her look like a grieving, responsible daughter. Malik sat next to her, checking his phone with a relaxed, arrogant smile. He looked up and caught my eye, offering a slow, mocking wink. He clearly thought his black market hacker was currently draining my fictional cryptocurrency accounts. He had no idea that federal agents were likely already reviewing the massive cache of evidence his own network had transmitted to the Pentagon overnight. David pulled out my chair at the defense table. I sat down, keeping my posture rigidly straight and my expression completely blank. I wore the same unbranded black blazer from the funeral. I did not want to look like a polished executive today. I wanted to look exactly like the pathetic, struggling dropout Richard had spent months describing. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge, and the entire room stood at attention. The judge took his seat, followed quickly by the 12 members of the jury. They were ordinary citizens, teachers, mechanics, office workers who had been pulled from their daily lives to sit in judgment of a family dispute. They looked at Richard with polite respect. Then they looked at me with cautious curiosity. "Are the plaintiffs ready to proceed with opening statements?" the judge asked, his voice booming through the sound system. Richard stood up immediately, buttoning his jacket. "We are ready, Your Honor." Richard walked slowly toward the jury box, allowing the silence in the room to build. He stopped, resting his hands lightly on the wooden rail separating him from the jurors. When he finally spoke, his voice was remarkably soft, trembling with a perfectly manufactured layer of profound sorrow. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Richard began, making eye contact with a middle-aged woman in the front row. "I stand before you today, not just as an attorney representing an estate, but as a grieving husband. 8 months ago, I buried my wife, Catherine. She was the heart of our family. A brilliant, loving woman who spent her final 6 weeks on this earth fighting a horrific, agonizing battle against stage 4 pancreatic cancer." Richard paused, letting the heavy emotional weight of his words sink into the jury. Several jurors nodded sympathetically. Audrey let out a quiet, perfectly timed sniffle from the gallery, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. During those final weeks, Catherine was not herself. Richard continued, his voice tightening with fake emotion. The pain was absolute agony. The doctors prescribed massive doses of morphine and other palliative narcotics just to keep her comfortable. Her mind, once so sharp and clear, became clouded. She suffered from severe medically induced dementia. She did not know what day it was. She barely recognized her own family. And it was during this period of extreme vulnerability that the defendant chose to strike. Richard turned his body slowly, pointing a sharp, accusatory finger directly at me. He dropped the soft, grieving husband persona and instantly transformed into the ruthless corporate litigator. "The defendant is my eldest daughter, Gwen," Richard stated, his voice now ringing with righteous anger. "You might look at her and see a young woman, but I assure you she is a 33-year-old parasite. Gwen has not worked a single day since college. She dropped out of a basic coding program 5 years ago and has been completely unemployed ever since. She has no W-2 forms. She has no verifiable legal income. She lives in a rundown studio apartment in South Boston, doing absolutely nothing with her life." I kept my eyes locked on Richard, refusing to look away or show any reaction. Beside me, David was writing a meaningless note on his legal pad, playing along with the charade. Instead of getting a job, instead of contributing to society, Gwen decided it was easier to simply leech off her family. Richard told the jury, his tone dripping with absolute disgust. "For years, my late wife quietly gave her money out of misplaced maternal guilt. But when Catherine was on her deathbed, Gwen saw an opportunity for a massive payday. Just 3 days before my wife passed away, while she was heavily medicated and completely stripped of her mental faculties, Gwen manipulated her into signing a wire transfer. She stole $500,000 from her dying mother and funneled it directly into a hidden shell corporation." The jury gasped collectively. A man in the second row shook his head, glaring at me with undisguised contempt. A younger woman crossed her arms, looking at me like I was a literal monster. Richard was playing them like a grand piano. "That money was not an inheritance," Richard argued, pacing back and forth. "That money was earmarked for the family trust to support her younger sister, Audrey, who sits behind me today. Audrey is a hard-working entrepreneur, struggling to keep her small cosmetics business afloat. Gwen knew this. She knew her sister needed that capital, but she took it anyway because she is a thief who preys on the weak." Richard stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the jury box again, leaning forward to deliver his final blow. "Over the course of this trial, we will present medical records proving Catherine lacked the mental capacity to authorize any financial transactions. We will present bank statements highlighting the defendant and her long history of financial abuse. We will show you that Gwen is a calculating manipulator who stole $500,000 to fund her own pathetic, lazy existence. We are asking you to return the stolen funds to the rightful estate and to finally hold this woman accountable for her disgusting crimes. Thank you." Richard walked back to the plaintiff table and sat down, looking incredibly smug. He leaned over and whispered something to Malik, who grinned widely in response. They truly believed they had completely destroyed me in the first 30 minutes of the trial. The entire jury was staring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. The judge looked at David, expecting a frantic opening statement from the defense. I sat perfectly still, waiting for the avalanche to fall on my father. Section 14. 1,000 words. David stood up slowly, adjusting his tie. He did not walk toward the jury box. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood at the defense table and delivered the shortest opening statement in the history of this federal courthouse. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," David said, his voice projecting a calm authority, "the plaintiff has just told you a highly emotional story. But courts of law do not operate on stories. They operate on hard, documented facts. We ask only that you pay very close attention to the specific claims made under oath today, because the truth is about to become undeniably clear. Thank you." David sat back down. The jury looked completely confused. Richard let out a short, scoffing laugh, clearly believing David had absolutely nothing to work with. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his microphone. "Call your first witness, counselor," the judge instructed. Richard buttoned his suit jacket, standing tall. "The plaintiff calls Audrey to the stand, Your Honor." Audrey stood up from the gallery, smoothing her conservative black dress. She walked toward the witness box, with her head slightly bowed, projecting the exact image of a dutiful, grieving daughter. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the whole truth. She sat down, adjusting the microphone perfectly so her soft, tremulous voice would carry across the entire room. Malik watched her from the gallery, beaming with predatory pride. He thought his wife was about to secure his financial salvation. Richard approached the witness stand, his face softening into a mask of paternal, gentle concern. "Audrey, could you please tell the jury about your relationship with your late mother during her final months?" Audrey took a shaky breath. "I was her primary caretaker," Audrey said, letting her voice waver just enough to sound authentic. "Gwen was never around. She had isolated herself for years, refusing to participate in our family. I managed my mother and her medical appointments, her comfort, and her personal finances. It was exhausting, but I loved her so much. And during this difficult time, did you and your mother discuss the future of your business?" Richard asked, gently guiding her exactly where he needed the narrative to go. "Yes," Audrey replied, wiping a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. "My cosmetics company was facing a temporary cash flow issue due to supply chain disruptions. My husband Malik runs a highly successful investment fund, and he was helping me restructure. My mother promised she would provide $500,000 as bridge capital. She said she wanted to see my brand succeed. She told me it was her final gift to our family legacy." Richard nodded solemnly, letting the jury absorb the emotional weight. "And what happened to that final gift, Audrey?" Audrey let out a quiet, tragic sob. "Gwen stole it. My sister, who never visited, never called, suddenly showed up at the hospital when the pain medication was at its highest dosage. She manipulated our mother into signing a wire transfer. She drained the account and hid the money. When I went to pay my suppliers, the funds were completely gone. My business is now on the verge of total collapse because my own sister robbed us blind." The jury members were visibly moved. A few of them glared at me, openly disgusted by the narrative. Audrey was delivering an award-winning performance, playing the devastated victim flawlessly. Richard thanked her and returned to his table, looking incredibly satisfied. He had painted the perfect picture. Now it was David and his turn to cross-examine. David stood up, picking up a single manila folder. He approached the podium, his demeanor completely non-threatening. He looked like an attorney who knew he had already lost the case. "Good morning, Audrey," David said politely. "I just have a few clarifying questions regarding the financial documents you submitted to this court." Audrey lifted her chin, offering David a look of mild condescension. She felt entirely invincible. "Of course," she said smoothly. David opened the folder. "You testified earlier and during your pre-trial deposition that you personally managed your mother and her finances. You submitted Exhibit B, a stack of bank statements showing regular transfers to my client Gwen. You claimed these were desperate pleas for money. Is that correct?" "Yes," Audrey stated firmly, her voice ringing with absolute confidence. "I printed those official statements myself. Gwen was constantly draining our mother and her accounts for years before the final theft." David nodded slowly, making sure the court reporter captured every single word. "And you are testifying under penalty of perjury today that you did not alter, redact, or misrepresent these specific banking records in any way whatsoever." "I am telling the truth." Audrey snapped, her tone dripping with righteous indignation. "Those documents are entirely accurate." David did not challenge the lie. He simply let it cement itself permanently into the federal record. He flipped to the next page in his folder. "Excellent. Now let us discuss the $500,000. You testified that this money was explicitly promised to you and your husband Malik to save your cosmetics brand. You also stated that Malik and his investment fund, Vanguard Zenith, is highly successful and solvent. Audrey glanced quickly at Malik in the gallery. Malik nodded slightly, a subtle gesture of encouragement. Yes, Audrey said, turning back to David. Malik runs a brilliant fund. He was simply facilitating the bridge capital to protect the family assets. David leaned forward, resting his hands on the wooden podium. So, to be absolutely clear, your husband and his investment fund is entirely legitimate and currently in good financial standing. You are swearing under oath that there is no imminent financial collapse or federal audit threatening Vanguard Zenith right now. Richard stood up sharply. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. My son-in-law and his business operations are not on trial here. David looked up at the judge. Your Honor, the witness just testified that the stolen funds were intended for that specific investment fund. Establishing the true financial health of Vanguard Zenith goes directly to the motive of this entire lawsuit. The judge frowned but nodded. I will allow it. The witness will answer the question. Audrey gripped the edges of the witness stand. She looked at Richard, who gave her a reassuring look. She felt entirely safe behind her father and his legal shield. Vanguard Zenith is incredibly successful, Audrey declared loudly, ensuring the jury heard her absolute certainty. My husband is a respected financial manager. We did not need the money because we were failing. We needed it because it was rightfully ours, and Gwen maliciously stole it out of pure spite. David smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the precise, calculated look of a predator watching a trap snap entirely shut. Thank you, Audrey, David said softly, closing his manila folder. I have no further questions for this witness. Audrey stood up from the witness box, looking incredibly triumphant. She smoothed her dress and walked back to the gallery, taking her seat next to Malik. They exchanged a victorious look. They truly believed they had just won the entire case. They had absolutely no idea that David had just successfully locked Audrey into multiple counts of federal perjury. He had flawlessly recorded her swearing to the legitimacy of manipulated bank documents and the financial stability of a massive criminal Ponzi scheme. The groundwork was entirely laid out. The explosive detonation was coming next. Richard stood up from his table, practically glowing with immense self-satisfaction. He straightened his expensive silk tie and projected his voice across the silent federal courtroom, ensuring every single person present felt his absolute authority. The plaintiff calls the defendant Gwen to the stand. I stood up from the defense table. I did not smooth my clothes or check my hair. I simply walked toward the witness box with measured, deliberate steps. The wooden floorboards creaked slightly under my cheap sneakers, providing a stark visual contrast to the polished Italian leather shoes everyone else in my family wore. I placed my right hand on the Bible and swore to tell the whole truth. As I sat down and adjusted the microphone, I looked directly at the jury box. They stared back at me with a heavy mixture of pity and revulsion, thoroughly convinced by Audrey and her spectacular, tearful performance. I shifted my gaze to Richard. He was pacing back and forth like a hungry shark, ready to devour a wounded seal. Let us establish some basic, undisputed facts for the jury. Richard began, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. You are 33 years old. You currently reside in a 400-square-foot apartment in South Boston. Is that correct? Yes, I replied, my voice steady and clear. And prior to living in that specific apartment, you resided on various couches belonging to friends because you could not afford to pay basic rent. Yes, I answered without hesitation. Richard nodded, ensuring the jury absorbed my incredibly pathetic housing history. 5 years ago, you were enrolled in a coding boot camp, a basic entry-level program for amateurs, but you dropped out. You quit the program completely. Why did you drop out, Gwen? I chose to pursue other opportunities, I stated calmly, keeping my face entirely blank. Richard let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed loudly. Other opportunities. That is a fascinating way to describe half a decade of absolute unemployment. Because according to the public record, you have not held a single verifiable job since you walked away from that program. You have no corporate affiliations. You have no business licenses registered in your name. You have absolutely nothing to show for the last 5 years of your entire life. I remained perfectly still. I did not take his bait. My silence only fueled his aggressive momentum. He marched back to his table and picked up a thick stack of printed documents, waving them dramatically in the air. "Let us talk about your finances," Richard said, pointing the papers at me. "These are the official tax records subpoenaed directly by this court. They are completely empty. You have not filed a tax form in 5 consecutive years. You have not reported a single dollar of earned income to the Internal Revenue Service. How exactly do you survive, Gwen?" "I manage my finances privately," I answered, refusing to break eye contact with him. Privately, Richard scoffed, turning to face the jury box so they could see his expression of pure, utter disgust. "You manage your finances by leeching off your family. You survive by manipulating a sick, dying woman into handing over $500,000 because you are entirely incapable of earning a living yourself. You are a financial black hole." David sat quietly at the defense table. He did not object to Richard and his relentless badgering. He let my father dig the hole as deep as humanly possible. "I did not manipulate my mother," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through his theatrical outrage. "The money she transferred was an authorized investment. She knew exactly where it was going. An investment." Richard yelled, slamming his hand down on the wooden podium. A loud crack echoed through the tense courtroom. "Do not insult the intelligence of this jury. You are a college dropout who lives in absolute poverty. You have zero credentials. You have no company. You have no clients. What exactly was your dying mother investing in?" I looked past Richard. I looked at Audrey and Malik sitting in the gallery. Malik was grinning widely, checking his expensive watch, likely counting down the minutes until his black market hacker broke through my laptop firewall. He was completely unaware that he had already doomed himself to federal prison. I brought my gaze back to my furious father. "She was investing in my company," I said clearly. Richard threw his hands up in the air, his face turning red. "What company? You do not have a company. You do not have an employer. You do not even have a tax record. I will ask you one more time under the penalty of perjury. How do you support yourself, Gwen? Why have you not filed a single income form in 5 years? I took a slow, deep breath. I adjusted my posture, sitting up perfectly straight in the witness chair. The entire courtroom was dead silent, waiting for me to finally crack under the immense pressure. "I do not file standard income forms because my employment structure is classified," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the microphone. "I work as a defense contractor for the United States government, and my income is routed through secure federal channels." For a split second, the courtroom was completely frozen in stunned silence. Then Richard burst into laughter. It was a loud, booming, uncontrollable laugh that filled the entire room. He gripped the edges of the podium, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. He turned to the jury, smiling broadly, inviting them to share in the sheer absurdity of my statement. Audrey covered her mouth in the gallery, giggling loudly behind her hand. Malik shook his head, looking at me like I had completely lost my mind. Even the judge leaned back in his leather chair, a deep frown creasing his forehead as he stared at me. "You work for the government," Richard choked out, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "The unemployed college dropout who lives in a South Boston slum works for the United States government. Tell me, Gwen, do you also work for the intelligence agencies? Are you a secret agent defending the country from your cheap futon?" "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Corps," I replied, refusing to react to his relentless mocking. "We specialize in quantum-resistant encryption architecture. My mother invested $500,000 to finalize a prototype for the Department of Defense." Richard slammed his hand on the podium again, his laughter instantly vanishing, replaced by furious indignation. "Your Honor, this is an absolute mockery of this court. The defendant is clearly experiencing a severe psychological break. She is sitting under oath, fabricating a delusional fantasy to avoid answering for her massive crimes. I move to have her held in contempt immediately." The judge looked at me severely, leaning over his high bench. "Miss Gwen, this is a federal court. You are currently under oath. Providing false or wildly fabricated testimony carries severe criminal penalties. I strongly advise you to answer the questions grounded in actual reality. I am telling the exact truth. Your Honor, I said, maintaining my calm, icy composure. Richard sneered, stepping closer to the witness box. You are a pathetic liar, Gwen. You have no defense company. You have no government contract. You are nothing but a thief who is currently committing perjury to avoid going to prison. Your Honor, I formally request that the defendant be held in criminal contempt of court immediately. Richard shouted, his voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. She has sat in that chair and fabricated an absolutely insane delusion. A defense contractor, a government operation. It is a pathetic, desperate attempt to distract this jury from her blatant theft. She is wasting the valuable time of this federal court. The judge leaned heavily over his elevated bench, glaring down at me with pure, unrestrained anger. The deep lines on his face were set in stone. He had clearly reached his absolute limit with what he perceived to be my insolent behavior. Miss Gwen, the judge said, his voice cold and unforgiving. You have presented zero evidence of these fantastical claims. I am holding you in direct criminal contempt until you drop this ridiculous fiction. Richard puffed out his chest, turning to shoot a victorious, gloating glance at the gallery behind him. Audrey had her hands clasped tightly together, leaning forward with a look of pure, malicious glee. Malik was still staring intently at his glowing phone screen, expecting his illegal digital transfer to complete any second now. He looked up just long enough to offer me a final, arrogant, mocking smirk. They thought the battle was completely over. I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked on the judge, waiting patiently for the exact moment the pendulum would violently swing in the other direction. The judge raised his wooden gavel high in the air, preparing to bring it down. Before the heavy gavel could strike the sounding block, a loud, reverberating crash echoed through the entire courtroom. The heavy, solid oak doors at the back of the gallery flew violently open, hitting the wooden stoppers with a deafening, explosive bang. The sudden noise caused every single person in the room to physically jump. The judge froze, his gavel suspended high in midair. Richard whipped around, his face twisting in sudden outrage. Audrey let out a small, terrified shriek. Malik shoved his phone deep into his pocket, his eyes darting toward the exit. 4 men marched through the open doorway. They moved with absolute military synchronization. They wore sharp, tailored black suits and dark sunglasses, despite the dim indoor lighting. Coiled communication wires rested discreetly behind their ears. They possessed the unmistakable rigid posture and calculated lethal movements of highly trained federal agents. Their faces were completely devoid of human emotion. The armed bailiff, positioned near the jury box, immediately reached for his holstered weapon. He took one aggressive step forward, prepared to intercept the unidentified intruders. The lead agent did not even break his rapid stride. He simply reached into his breast pocket and flipped open a black leather wallet, revealing a gleaming silver federal badge. The bailiff went completely pale and immediately stepped back. Richard turned brilliant red with absolute fury. "What is the exact meaning of this?" Richard bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at the men. "This is a closed federal proceeding. You cannot just barge into my courtroom. Bailiff, remove these men immediately." The agents completely ignored him. They did not look at Richard. They did not look at the stunned jury. They walked in a tight diamond formation straight down the center aisle, moving swiftly past the wooden benches of the gallery. When they reached the low wooden gate separating the public seating from the legal tables, 2 of the agents stopped abruptly, standing shoulder to shoulder to physically block the main exit. The other 2 stepped smoothly through the gate and took up positions directly behind my chair. The entire courtroom descended into absolute chaos. The jury members began whispering frantically to one another, pointing nervously at the federal agents. Audrey gripped Malik by his arm, looking around with wide, terrified eyes. Malik was sweating profusely. He swallowed hard, his arrogant smirk vanishing from his face. He knew elite agents did not show up for simple family disputes. He was starting to realize that something had gone catastrophically wrong with his black market hacker and the stolen laptop. The judge slammed his gavel down repeatedly, trying desperately to regain control of his chaotic courtroom. "Order!" the judge shouted, his voice cracking slightly over the microphone. "I demand order in this court right now. Identify yourselves immediately, or I will hold every single one of you in contempt." The lead agent remained perfectly silent, staring straight ahead, unblinking. That was when David finally stood up. My attorney had sat perfectly still during Richard and his entire loud theatrical performance. He had let my father insult me, degrade me, and demand my immediate arrest. Now the trap was fully triggered and it was time for David to close the lid. David picked up his leather portfolio from the defense table. He moved with the calm, deliberate grace of a former military officer. He unzipped the main compartment and reached inside. The room fell into a dead, breathless silence as every single eye watched his hands. David pulled out a heavy manila envelope. It was securely sealed with a thick layer of bright red wax. Stamped directly into the center of the wax was the unmistakable official crest of the United States Department of Defense. David turned and walked right past Richard. My father stood completely frozen at the plaintiff table, his aggressive posture completely evaporating into thin air. He stared blindly at the red wax seal, his seasoned legal mind struggling to comprehend why a defense attorney in a family civil suit was suddenly holding classified military correspondence while surrounded by armed federal agents. David stopped directly in front of the high wooden bench. He looked up at the judge, his expression projecting absolute, unyielding authority. He did not shout. He did not need to. His voice was smooth and terrifyingly even, cutting sharply through the heavy silence. "Your Honor," David said, holding the envelope out. "Before the plaintiff continues this narrative, the defense submits Exhibit A for your immediate classified review." The judge stared at the envelope. He looked at the federal agent standing at rigid attention behind my chair. He looked back at David. Slowly, with a trembling hand, the judge reached down and took the heavy manila envelope. Richard tried to speak, taking a hesitant step forward, but the words died in his throat. He realized he was standing on train tracks with a massive locomotive rushing toward him. The entire courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for the judge to open the seal. The final devastating blow was about to officially land. The sharp crack of the thick red wax echoed like a gunshot in the absolutely silent courtroom. The judge slid his silver letter opener beneath the heavy flap of the manila envelope, tearing it open with trembling hands. He pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper. The bright seal of the United States Department of Defense was printed clearly at the very top. He placed the document on his elevated wooden bench and adjusted his reading glasses. Richard stood at the plaintiff table, his mouth slightly open, his usual arrogance completely evaporating. He looked at David, who was standing perfectly still, projecting the calm discipline of a military officer. Richard then looked at the 4 armed federal agents positioned around my chair. He tried to swallow, but his throat was visibly dry. He was a man who relied entirely on knowing every single detail of a case before stepping foot inside a courtroom. Right now, he knew absolutely nothing, and it was absolutely terrifying him. The judge began to read the letter. I watched his eyes scan the first few lines. At first, his expression was one of severe annoyance, likely assuming this was some elaborate stalling tactic engineered by the defense. But as his eyes moved further down the page, that annoyance instantly vanished. It was replaced by a look of profound, absolute shock. The color completely drained from his weathered face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His hands began to shake slightly, making the heavy paper rustle against the wood of his bench. He read the document a second time, as if his brain simply refused to process the immense gravity of the words on the page. He slowly took off his reading glasses and placed them next to his gavel. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at the empty jury box. He looked directly at me. The harsh, judgmental glare he had directed at me just 5 minutes ago was completely gone. In its place was a look of deep, cautious respect, mixed with a healthy amount of fear. He now understood exactly who I was and what I did for the federal government. Your Honor. Richard finally spoke, his voice lacking its usual booming confidence. I must strongly object to this highly irregular interruption. This is a civil trial regarding a family trust, and we are in the middle of my cross-examination. I demand to know what that document says and why these men are disrupting my courtroom. The judge did not even acknowledge Richard. He picked up his wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block with a massive resonant crack that made everyone in the room jump. All rise! The judge bellowed, his voice amplified by the microphone but trembling with a new, undeniable urgency. Court is in recess. I am immediately invoking the Classified Information Procedures Act under the direct authority of the United States Department of Defense. The entire courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and frantic whispers. The jury members looked around in absolute bewilderment, having no idea what that act actually meant, but fully understanding the terrifying tone of the judge. Richard gripped the edges of his table, his knuckles turning entirely white. He knew exactly what the Classified Information Procedures Act was. It was a federal statute designed to handle highly sensitive classified national security information in a court of law. It was never under any circumstances invoked in a simple civil dispute over a family trust fund. Your Honor, you cannot be serious, Richard shouted, panic finally breaking through his carefully maintained professional facade. This is a simple fraud case. There is absolutely zero classified information involved here. This is a massive stunt by the defense to derail my momentum and confuse the jury. You will remain completely silent, counselor, the judge roared, pointing his gavel directly at my father. You have absolutely no idea what you have brought into my courtroom today. One more word out of turn, and I will have these federal agents place you in federal custody. Do you understand me? Richard snapped his mouth shut. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a live landmine and heard the metallic click. He was completely paralyzed. The judge turned his attention to the armed bailiff and the federal agents. Clear the room, the judge ordered, his voice ringing with absolute authority. I want the jury escorted back to the deliberation room immediately. I want the press gallery completely emptied. I want all public spectators removed from this courtroom right now. Bailiff, you will lock the heavy oak doors from the inside. Nobody enters or leaves this room without my explicit verbal authorization. The federal agents moved instantly. Two of them stepped toward the gallery, directing the shocked spectators toward the exit with sharp, commanding hand gestures. The bailiff hurriedly ushered the bewildered jury out through the side door. The reporters in the back row scrambled to grab their notepads and recorders, practically sprinting out of the room under the severe gaze of the government agents. Audrey jumped up from her seat in the gallery, her face twisted in a mask of pure terror. She grabbed Malik by the arm, trying to pull him toward the exit with the rest of the public spectators. She wanted to escape the suffocating tension of the room. The individuals involved in the civil suit will remain seated. The lead federal agent commanded, his voice booming across the emptying room. He pointed a firm finger directly at Audrey and Malik. Return to your seats immediately. You are not permitted to leave this secured area. Audrey collapsed back onto the wooden bench, sobbing quietly. Malik sat frozen, his eyes darting frantically toward the locked doors. He was sweating profusely, his expensive suit jacket suddenly looking entirely too tight. He realized this was no longer a civil trial about his mother-in-law and her money. This was a federal lockdown. Richard stood alone at the plaintiff table, watching his entire orchestrated performance burn to the ground. His carefully selected jury was gone. His audience was gone. The press he had invited to witness my public humiliation was locked out in the hallway. He had spent 8 months building a perfect legal trap to destroy my life and steal my company funding. But as the heavy oak doors slammed shut and the deadbolts clicked loudly into place, Richard finally realized the terrifying truth. He was not the predator in this room. He was the prey. And he was entirely trapped inside a locked federal courtroom with the United States government. The silence that descended upon the locked courtroom was heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. David walked slowly back to the defense table and took his seat beside me. He projected an aura of absolute calm, folding his hands neatly over his legal pad. I remained perfectly still, my posture straight, and my expression completely unreadable. I looked at my father watching the arrogant corporate lawyer hyperventilate in his tailored suit. He had demanded a war, and now the full weight of the military-industrial complex had arrived to deliver his absolute destruction. The heavy silence in the locked courtroom was finally broken by the judge clearing his throat. He looked down at the single sheet of paper bearing the Department of Defense seal, as if it were a live explosive. He looked at the lead federal agent standing stoically by the wooden gate, and then turned his gaze to David. "Counselor," the judge said, his voice completely devoid of its previous hostility. "This document indicates that the defendant in this civil matter is an active Tier 1 defense contractor. It also states that the financial assets currently under dispute in this courtroom are intrinsically tied to classified military infrastructure. Is this accurate?" David stood up, buttoning his jacket with a crisp, professional motion. "It is entirely accurate, Your Honor. My client Gwen is not an unemployed college dropout. She is the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Corp, a highly classified cybersecurity firm specializing in quantum-resistant encryption architecture. For the past 5 years, she has been operating in total stealth mode, developing defense protocols that are currently protecting national security interests. Her employment history and financial records are heavily classified, which is exactly why she does not possess standard public tax forms." Richard gripped the edge of the plaintiff table, his knuckles white. He shook his head frantically, unable to process the words coming out of David and his mouth. "That is impossible," Richard stammered, his voice cracking. "She lives in a dump. She has nothing. This is some kind of elaborate hoax." David ignored my father completely. He reached into his leather portfolio and extracted a thick, bound legal document. He walked calmly toward the bench and handed it up to the judge. "What the plaintiff has continuously characterized as elder abuse and theft. Your Honor was in reality a perfectly legal, thoroughly documented corporate transaction," David explained, projecting his voice so Audrey and Malik could hear every single devastating syllable in the gallery. 8 months ago, Catherine recognized that Aegis Corp was on the precipice of a massive technological breakthrough, but required immediate capital to finalize a working prototype for a Pentagon bid. She voluntarily and enthusiastically provided $500,000 to my client. However, it was not a gift, and it certainly was not a theft. David paused, letting the anticipation build in the suffocating room. "It was an angel investment," David declared. Catherine signed a binding corporate purchasing agreement acquiring exactly 5% equity in Aegis Corp. She transferred the funds with a sound mind and absolute clarity. The medical records the plaintiff submitted today, claiming otherwise, are complete and utter fabrications. Richard took a step back, bumping into his own chair. He looked like the floor had just dropped out from underneath him. Audrey let out a quiet whimpering gasp from the gallery. She had spent months going on national podcasts crying about how I stole her cosmetic company Bridge Capital. Now she was staring at the undeniable proof that her own mother had actively chosen to invest in my genius instead of her failing brand. "But that is just the beginning of the reality the plaintiff failed to uncover." David continued, his tone shifting into something sharp and lethal. 3 days ago, Aegis Corp successfully passed the final Level 6 penetration test mandated by the United States military. Our encryption architecture proved entirely impenetrable. As a direct result, the Pentagon authorized the immediate and complete acquisition of Aegis Corp and all its proprietary technology. The judge leaned forward, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. "The acquisition?" David asked smoothly. "Yes, Your Honor. The United States government has officially purchased my client and her company for $1.2 billion. The number hit the room like a physical shockwave. $1.2 billion. Richard literally collapsed into his chair. His legs simply gave out. He stared at me with his mouth hanging open, his eyes bulging in absolute horror. He had spent his entire life building a respectable corporate law career, amassing a few $1 million in wealth, and using it to mercilessly control everyone around him. He had looked down on me as a pathetic failure. And in one single breath, he learned that I was a self-made billionaire who held contracts with the highest levels of the federal government. Audrey started to hyperventilate. She gripped the wooden bench in front of her, violently shaking her head. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking with hysterical denial. "No, she cannot have that much money. She is nothing." David was not finished. He turned to look directly at Richard, his expression radiating pure legal dominance. Since Catherine purchased a 5% equity stake in Aegis Corp prior to her death, that original $500,000 investment has grown exponentially. As of the acquisition finalization this morning, Catherine and her corporate stake is now officially valued at exactly $60 million. Malik let out a loud, guttural groan. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. He had orchestrated this entire malicious lawsuit because he desperately needed $500,000 to hide his massive financial crimes. He had bullied me, threatened me, and broken into my life for what amounted to pocket change compared to the actual value of the investment. And before the plaintiff attempts to lay claim to those newly acquired funds, David said, turning back to the judge, "I must direct the court to the final addendum of Catherine and her investment contract." Because she knew her husband Richard would immediately attempt to seize any assets tied to her name, Catherine established a blind ironclad trust alongside the equity purchase. The contract explicitly dictates that upon her death, her entire 5% stake in Aegis Corp defaults directly and exclusively to the company founder. David pointed a firm, steady finger at me. "Legally, financially, and permanently, that $60 million belongs entirely to Gwen. The money was never stolen. It was invested, multiplied, and rightfully inherited. The plaintiff has no legal standing to claim a single penny of it." The judge looked down at the investment contract, running his finger along Catherine and her perfectly lucid signature. He looked at the Department of Defense letter again. Then he looked at Richard, who was currently trembling in his custom-tailored suit. "Counselor," the judge said, looking at my father with a gaze of pure, unadulterated disgust, "you brought a federal lawsuit against your own daughter claiming she was a destitute thief. You demanded the court freeze her assets and seize her electronics. You paraded witnesses in here to testify to her absolute poverty, and yet she is sitting at that defense table as a billionaire defense contractor. You have wasted the time of this court, and you have done so with what appears to be aggressively fabricated evidence." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His arrogant, booming voice had completely abandoned him. He was a man utterly broken by his own monumental hubris. He had spent his entire life demanding that I prove my worth to him. I had just proven it to the tune of $1 billion, and it had absolutely destroyed him. But the demolition of my family was not yet complete. I looked past my shattered father and focused my gaze on Malik. He was still sitting in the gallery, sweating profusely, clutching his knees in absolute terror. David had just dismantled Richard and Audrey. Now it was time for the federal agent standing silently behind me to dismantle Malik. The lead agent, a tall man with a square jaw and a completely unreadable expression, stepped out from behind my chair. He bypassed the plaintiff table entirely and walked straight toward the wooden gate separating the legal floor from the gallery. He unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The sharp metallic clink cut through the dead silence of the room. Malik pressed his back against the wooden bench. He was sweating so profusely that his expensive dress shirt was soaked through. Audrey shrank away from him, her eyes darting frantically between the approaching agent and her terrified husband. Malik Carter, the lead agent, said, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of federal authority. You are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in direct coordination with the Department of Defense. Malik shook his head rapidly, holding his hands up. For what? I am just a financial manager. I have not done anything to the military. You violated the National Security Act, the agent stated coldly. Yesterday afternoon, you stole a classified hardware device from a corporate law office. You transported that device to your investment firm. You then used a physical Ethernet cable to plug a Level 6 military honeypot directly into your company mainframe. Audrey gasped, looking at Malik with wide, horrified eyes. Malik opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His arrogant facade had completely crumbled into absolute pathetic terror. You bypassed a signed federal preservation order. The agent continued, stepping through the wooden gate and looming over Malik. You hired an illicit black market operative to launch a brute force decryption attack against United States military infrastructure. That is textbook cyber espionage. You committed an act of digital warfare against the federal government just to find a few $100,000. Malik raised his trembling hands defensively. It was just a laptop. I thought it was just a regular laptop holding cryptocurrency. I did not know it was a military asset. My father-in-law told me it was safe to take. Richard violently flinched at the plaintiff table. He spun around to face the gallery. "Do not drag me into your treason, you idiot," Richard screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "I told you to leave that machine alone in the vault." "It gets significantly worse for you," Malik David interjected, turning in his chair to face the gallery. "The proprietary software you tried to hack did exactly what it was programmed to do. It initiated an automated self-defense protocol. The moment you connected that Ethernet cable, Aegis Core bypassed your pathetic commercial firewalls in a matter of seconds. It silently indexed every hidden folder and every encrypted email. It performed a complete, unrestricted reverse scan of your entire corporate network." Malik let out a loud, choked sob. He grabbed his chest as if he were having a physical heart attack. He knew exactly what was hiding on those servers. The National Security Agency received a massive automated data dump from your servers last night, the lead federal agent confirmed, pulling a folded warrant from his breast pocket. "We did not just capture your cyber espionage attempt. We captured your dual financial ledgers. We captured your falsified client portfolios. We captured the offshore wire transfers you used to launder money through your wife and her cosmetics brand." Audrey shrieked, jumping up from the bench. She backed away from Malik as if he were suddenly radioactive. "What is he talking about?" Audrey demanded, her voice shrill with rising hysteria. "What money laundering? What did you do to my company?" "Your husband does not run a successful boutique investment fund," David said smoothly, delivering the ultimate lethal blow. "He runs a spectacular, completely fraudulent Ponzi scheme. He is utterly bankrupt. He owes millions of dollars to institutional investors. He initiated this entire malicious lawsuit because he desperately needed $500,000 of untraceable cash to hide his massive financial crimes from an impending federal audit." Malik lunged toward the aisle, an act of pure primal desperation. He thought he could somehow run past highly trained federal agents and escape a locked courtroom. He did not make it 2 steps. The agents moved with terrifying speed. They grabbed Malik by his expensive suit jacket, slammed him face first onto the heavy wooden bench, and violently twisted his arms behind his back. The steel handcuffs ratcheted shut with a brutal, definitive clicking sound. "Malik Carter, you have the right to remain silent," the agent recited, hauling the disgraced financial manager to his feet. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a federal court of law." Malik was openly weeping now, his tears dripping onto the polished wood floor. He looked at Audrey, begging for help, but she simply turned her back on him, covering her face as her perfect wealthy lifestyle evaporated into thin air. The agents dragged Malik toward the heavy oak doors, waiting for the judge to authorize their exit. The judge watched the arrest with a completely unreadable expression. Then he slowly turned his furious gaze back to the plaintiff table. Richard was gripping the edges of his table so tightly his fingers were trembling. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. He had just watched his son-in-law get arrested for cyber espionage and massive wire fraud. But Richard was a corporate lawyer, and his legal mind suddenly realized a much more immediate, horrifying truth. Counselor, the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch. Let us return to the matter of your civil lawsuit. You stood in my courtroom today and delivered an opening statement claiming the defendant stole from a woman incapacitated by severe dementia. You provided physical evidence to support this incredibly serious allegation. The judge reached out and picked up the thick medical file Richard had so arrogantly submitted during the pre-trial deposition. He held the folder up in the air for everyone to see. You submitted Exhibit C to this court. The judge continued, his eyes locked onto my father. These are supposedly certified medical evaluations from an attending physician. They explicitly state that your late wife lacked the legal capacity to authorize any financial transactions. Yet the defense has just provided irrefutable classified proof that Catherine executed a highly sophisticated, legally binding corporate purchasing agreement. An agreement that the Department of Defense thoroughly vetted and verified before acquiring this company. Richard swallowed hard. His face was entirely devoid of blood. He realized that the perjury he committed during the deposition was now a permanent part of the federal record. He had sworn under oath that those medical documents were authentic. He had confidently walked into a federal trap of his own making. Your Honor. Richard stammered, his voice weak and pathetic. I relied on the medical professionals. I simply submitted the documents provided to my office. Do not insult my intelligence, the judge roared, slamming his hand flat against the bench. You are a senior litigator. You know exactly what you did. You manipulated medical records. You found a corrupt physician willing to falsify documents, or you fabricated these addendums yourself. You submitted forged evidence to a federal judge in a calculated attempt to defraud your own daughter out of $60 million. I can explain. Richard pleaded, holding his hands up in surrender. You will explain it to the State Bar Association, the judge countered, his voice dripping with absolute venom. And you will explain it to the federal prosecutor. Submitting forged documents and committing perjury in a federal courtroom carries a mandatory prison sentence. You orchestrated a massive malicious fraud scheme inside my courtroom. Richard collapsed back into his chair. The brilliant, untouchable corporate lawyer was completely destroyed. He stared blankly at the polished wooden table, realizing that his entire prestigious career, his wealth and his freedom were entirely gone. He had dug a massive grave intending to bury me in it, and he had just thrown himself headfirst into the dirt. The trap had closed perfectly. The trap had closed perfectly. The judge did not break eye contact with my father. He picked up his wooden gavel, holding it firmly in his hand. This court finds the plaintiff and his claims to be entirely without merit. The judge announced, his voice projecting absolute finality. The lawsuit against Gwen is hereby dismissed with extreme prejudice. You are legally barred from ever bringing this malicious matter before a court again. But your profound legal troubles are just beginning, counselor. I am immediately forwarding the complete transcripts of today and the pre-trial deposition along with the forged medical records directly to the State Bar Association. I am also recommending that the United States Attorney open a full criminal investigation into your coordinated attempt to commit federal fraud and perjury. You have disgraced the legal profession, Richard. You will surrender your license to practice law, and you will prepare to defend yourself against severe federal criminal charges. The judge struck the sounding block with a thunderous, resonant crack. This court is permanently adjourned. The judge stood up and walked briskly out of the courtroom, his black robes flowing behind him. The remaining federal agents physically marched Malik through the heavy oak doors, dragging him toward a waiting government transport vehicle. His arrogant swagger was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic shuffling of a ruined criminal facing decades behind bars. Richard remained frozen at the plaintiff table. His junior associate hastily packed a briefcase and practically sprinted away, wanting absolutely no connection to a disgraced lawyer facing federal indictment. My father was entirely alone. He stared blankly at the polished wood, his massive ego utterly shattered. He had spent his entire life, demanding perfection and blind obedience, using his wealth to control our family. Now he possessed absolutely nothing. His reputation was destroyed, his career was over, and his freedom was in serious jeopardy. David smiled, closing his leather portfolio. He looked at me with deep professional respect. "It is a good day to be a defense contractor, Gwen. We should get you back to the secure facility. The acquisition paperwork needs your final signature." I stood up, smoothing my simple black blazer. I felt incredibly light. The crushing burden of being the family disappointment, the heavy weight of their relentless emotional abuse had completely evaporated into thin air. I was finally free. Before I could take a single step toward the center aisle, Audrey suddenly lunged across the gallery divider. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging desperately into my sleeve. Her face was a horrific mess of running mascara and terrified tears. The glamorous social media influencer persona had entirely vanished, leaving behind a panicked, broken woman. "Gwen, please," Audrey sobbed, her voice cracking with pure, raw panic. "You cannot just leave. You have to help me. Malik is going to prison. The government is going to seize our bank accounts and our house to pay back his investors. My cosmetics brand is already drowning in massive debt. My suppliers are cutting me off tomorrow. I have absolutely nothing left." I looked down at her hand gripping my jacket. I did not pull away immediately. I let her feel the profound shift in our power dynamic. Just 8 months ago, she stood over my mother and her grave, laughing at my cheap clothes and calling me a pathetic, unemployed failure. Just 2 weeks ago, she sat in a podcast studio and broadcasted vicious lies about me to millions of listeners. Now she was hyperventilating, clinging to me like a drowning rat on a sinking ship. "We are sisters," Gwen Audrey begged, dropping to her knees on the hard wooden floor. "Mom loved us both. She would want you to help me. You have $60 million. Just give me $1 million. Just $500,000 to pay my suppliers and hire a decent defense lawyer. You have so much money now. You will not even miss it. Please, Gwen. I will do anything." I looked down at my weeping sister. I felt absolutely zero pity. I felt no lingering familial obligation. She had happily participated in a malicious plot to frame me for elder abuse and throw me in a concrete cell. She had built her entire online identity by stepping on my neck and treating me like garbage. I slowly reached out and forcefully peeled her fingers off my jacket one by one. "You do not get to invoke our mother," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, lethal whisper. "She knew exactly what you and Richard were. That is precisely why she secured her investment in a blind trust. She wanted to build an impenetrable fortress, and she chose me to build it. You called me a parasite, Audrey. You told the entire world that I was a manipulative thief. You tried to destroy my life for bridge capital." Audrey continued to sob, shaking her head frantically. "I was desperate," she choked out. "Malik made me do it. I'm so sorry." "You are only sorry because you got caught," I replied, stepping away from her trembling form. "Your cosmetics company failed because you are a terrible businesswoman. Your husband is going to federal prison because he is a massive fraud. And you are bankrupt because you spent your entire life relying on other people to fund your superficial existence. My money is clean, Audrey. It is protected by the United States government, and it belongs entirely to me. You and Richard will never see a single penny of it. Have a wonderful life." I turned my back on my sister, leaving her sobbing pathetically on the courtroom floor. I walked down the center aisle, my head held high. David walked faithfully beside me. We pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the bright marble hallway. A swarm of reporters had gathered outside the security barricade, shouting frantic questions about the federal agents and the sudden lockdown. I completely ignored them. I did not need to defend my reputation or explain my immense success to the media. The truth was already permanently cemented in the federal record. We walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the cool, crisp Boston air. A massive armored black sport utility vehicle was idling at the curb. Two government security contractors stood by the open passenger door, waiting respectfully for my arrival. I looked back at the imposing stone pillars of the courthouse one last time. I had walked into that building as a vulnerable target. I was leaving it as a billionaire, a recognized national security asset, and a woman who had completely reclaimed her own destiny. I slid into the back of the armored vehicle. The heavy ballistic door slammed shut, sealing out the noise of the city. I leaned back into the plush leather seat and smiled. The powerful engine roared to life, carrying me away from the toxic ruins of my family and driving me straight into a brilliant, untouchable future. The story of Gwen and her family's spectacular downfall serves as a masterful exploration of the power of silent resilience in the face of toxic validation. For years, Gwen endured relentless psychological abuse, public humiliation, and the agonizing label of the family disappointment. Her father and sister built their own precarious identities by standing on her neck, completely blinded by their own arrogance and greed. The most profound lesson we can extract from this narrative is that true worth does not require a toxic audience's applause. Gwen could have easily broken her cover to defend her ego when her family mocked her lifestyle or her supposed dropout status. Most people would have screamed their success from the rooftops just to prove their abusers wrong. Instead, Gwen understood a crucial truth: arguing with individuals who are deeply committed to misunderstanding you is a phenomenal waste of energy. She channeled her pain into building an impenetrable fortress, both literally with her billion-dollar cybersecurity firm and figuratively within her own mind. Her ultimate victory wasn't just the massive Pentagon buyout or seeing her abusers face federal consequences for their crimes. The real triumph was her absolute emotional emancipation. She allowed her family's staggering hubris to be their own undoing, using their greed as the very mechanism that exposed their fraud. This narrative reminds us that we never have to internalize the false, damaging narratives others project onto us to make themselves feel superior. We can quietly build our empires in the dark, letting our undeniable success do all the talking when the perfect moment finally arrives. If you are currently dealing with people who underestimate your value, take a step back today to silently invest in your own growth instead of seeking their approval.